Do not eat this meal. You are being targeted. Trust me. She had folded the note with shaking fingers and slipped it beneath the edge of his plate while pretending to adjust his silverware. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was surprised nobody could hear it. She didn't know who he was. She only knew what she had seen, and what she had seen made her sick. If you've ever watched someone do the right thing when it cost them everything, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Emily Carter had learned early in life that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who looked away and those who couldn't. She had spent 27 years trying to figure out which kind she was, and most of those years she had told herself quietly, honestly, that she was the first kind. The looking away kind. The kind that survived. She needed this job. That was not a preference or a convenience. It was the architecture of her entire existence. Her mother, Patricia Carter, had spent the last 14 months moving between hospital rooms and rehabilitation centers after a stroke that had taken the left side of her face and most of her independence. The medical bills were a number Emily had stopped writing down, because every time she saw it, something inside her chest went cold and hollow. Her younger brother Danny was 19 and brilliant in a way that broke her heart. Brilliant enough to have earned a partial scholarship to a state university in Connecticut. Not brilliant enough for it to cover more than a third of what he actually needed. Emily made up the difference. She made up a lot of differences. The restaurant was called Cassini's. It occupied a narrow, beautiful space on the east side of Midtown Manhattan. The kind of place that looked like it had existed since before the war, and intended to exist long after everyone currently alive had turned to dust. The walls were dark wood and cream plaster. The lighting was low and amber. The tablecloths were heavy linen changed twice a day. It was not the most famous restaurant in the city, but among certain people, certain careful, discreet, particular people, it was considered the best. The food was exceptional. The wine list was extraordinary. And the staff under the management of Anthony Russo were exceptional in a way that had nothing to do with their talent and everything to do with their terror. Anthony Russo was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and eyes the color of old pewter. He had been the general manager of Cassini's for 9 years, and in those 9 years, he had constructed a kingdom out of anxiety. He knew every employee's weakest point. He knew who needed the overtime. He knew who had immigration complications. He knew who was sending money home to a sick parent, who was one missed paycheck from eviction, who had made a mistake in their personal life that could be used against them if the moment called for it. He kept mental files on all of them, and he consulted those files with the precision of a man who understood that knowledge was the most durable currency in the world. He had never once struck an employee. He had never needed to. The threat was always sufficient. Emily had been at Cassini's for 6 years, which made her, in the strange ecology of restaurant life, something close to a veteran. She had watched people come and go. She had watched Anthony break 3 different employees in the year before she arrived. She had heard the story secondhand, and then later she had seen it happen herself. A busser named Rodrigo, who had argued with Anthony about a scheduling error. A hostess named Claire, who had seated a customer incorrectly during a busy service. A line cook named Hassan, who had been 5 minutes late twice in a week because the subway had failed him both times. Anthony had not fired any of them immediately. That was not his style. He had simply made their lives inside that restaurant so difficult, so humiliating, so publicly degrading, that they had eventually chosen to leave on their own. It was cleaner that way. Cleaner for him. Emily had survived by being good at her job and careful with her distances. She was an excellent waitress, not in the performed theatrical way of someone chasing tips, but in the quiet, competent way of someone who paid attention. She noticed when a customer's water glass was getting low before they noticed it themselves. She could read the difference between a couple celebrating something and a couple fighting about something, and she adjusted accordingly. She remembered orders without writing them down, a skill she had developed not to show off, but because it made customers feel seen, and feeling seen was something most people hungered for more than food. She stayed out of Anthony's path. She said good evening and yes, absolutely, and I'll take care of that. She did not complain. She did not organize. She did not make herself into something that required managing. And so she survived, and her mother's bills got paid, and Danny stayed in school, and the whole precarious structure of her life continued to stand. That was the plan. That was the arrangement she had made with herself. Until the Thursday night in February when everything changed. It had been a slow service to start. February was always slower than December, the post-holiday lull settling over the city like a cold fog, and by 8 o'clock, Cassini's was running at maybe 60% capacity. The kitchen was calm. The staff were moving efficiently. Emily had 3 tables, 2 of which were finishing dessert, and 1 of which had just ordered their second bottle of wine and would be there for at least another hour. She was refilling the bread basket at table 14 when she heard the front door open. She didn't look up immediately. The hostess, a young woman named Sophie, who had only been at Cassini's for 3 months and was still learning which customers to be afraid of, stepped forward to greet the new arrival. Emily heard Sophie say, "Good evening, welcome to Cassini's. Do you have a reservation?" And then she heard a quiet voice say, "No, I don't." Something in that voice made Emily look up. The man standing at the host station was at first assessment unremarkable. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, she guessed, though he carried his age in a way that made precision difficult. He was not tall. He was not particularly large. He wore a dark coat, charcoal or navy, it was hard to tell in the entrance light, and beneath it, a dark suit that was well made, but not ostentatious. No tie, no watch visible. No accessories of any kind that announced anything. His face was square and still, the face of a man who had spent a very long time learning not to reveal what he was thinking. His hair was dark with silver running through it, cut close and neat. His eyes, when they moved across the room for just a moment before settling back on Sophie, were dark and extremely calm. Emily registered him the way she registered every customer, quickly automatically cataloging what she might need to know to serve him well. Older man alone, no reservation, probably wants a quiet table. Unassuming. Not the kind of customer Anthony would care about. She went back to the bread basket. She was wrong about that last part. She didn't know it yet, but she was very wrong. Sophie had just begun explaining that they could certainly accommodate him, that there were several available tables this evening, when Anthony appeared. Emily noticed it peripherally at first. Anthony was in the back near the service station. She had seen him there 10 minutes ago. And now he was at the front of the house, moving across the floor with a speed that was unusual for him. Anthony moved slowly as a general rule. Slowly and deliberately, because moving slowly was a way of communicating that you owned the space you were moving through. But right now he was crossing the restaurant at something close to a hurry, and his face had changed. The pewter eyes were different. Not warmer exactly. Anthony Russo's eyes were never warm but different. Alert in a way Emily hadn't seen before. Focused in a way that looked almost like caution. "Mr. Anthony began, and then stopped himself. He leaned close to the quiet man and said something Emily couldn't hear. The quiet man said something back, very brief, almost dismissive. Almost. Anthony straightened, smiled. The smile was the most disturbing thing Emily had seen in recent memory, because she had worked for this man for 6 years, and she had never once seen him smile like that, like he was trying to produce an expression he had only read about in a manual. "Right this way," Anthony said. "We have an excellent table for you." He led the man to table 7. Table 7 was near the kitchen. Emily stopped moving entirely. Table 7 was where Anthony put customers he wanted to manage, customers he needed to keep at a slight disadvantage. The noise from the kitchen, the constant traffic of servers moving in and out, the slightly inadequate lighting, the table that wobbled almost imperceptibly on its near leg. Just enough to be annoying, but not enough to be complain-worthy. Experienced customers at casinos knew to avoid table 7. First-timers didn't know until it was too late. Anthony was seating this quiet, unremarkable stranger at the worst table in the restaurant. And then Anthony looked across the floor and found Emily's eyes, and for a brief second, something moved across his face that she identified with a cold, sinking certainty as intention. He crooked one finger. She went. Wawa. He spoke to her quietly, standing near the service station, where the other staff couldn't easily hear. His voice was completely level, the way it always was when he was most dangerous. "Table 7 tonight is yours," he said. "Make sure he's comfortable. Make sure he orders." "Of course," Emily said. "Marco's been briefed on the specials tonight," Anthony continued. "I've asked him to prepare something personal for our guest, something special." Emily nodded. "Make sure he tries the branzino," Anthony said. "It's been sitting." He said it casually, the way you might mention weather. "And the antipasto. Tell him the burrata is imported. It isn't." Emily heard what he was saying. Every word of it, all of it, exactly as he meant it. She said, "Understood," and she walked back toward the floor. For the next 4 minutes, she stood at the service station and did absolutely nothing, which was unusual enough that Rosa, one of the other servers, glanced at her and asked if she was okay. "Fine," Emily said. "Just checking my section." She was not checking her section. She was standing very still and conducting a rapid, silent internal argument with herself. The argument went like this: "You don't know this man. You don't know why Anthony has it out for him, and Anthony always has reasons. Anthony always has reasons that have nothing to do with you, and those reasons are not your business and never have been. Your business is your mother's hospital bill. Your business is Danny's tuition. Your business is staying employed at this restaurant for the next year and a half until something changes, something shifts, something opens up that allows you to breathe. Anthony has done worse than this. Anthony has done considerably worse than ordering bad food for a customer he doesn't like. That is not your responsibility. You did not build this man's restaurant or his management style or his cruelty. You arrived here after it was already in place, and you survive inside it because you are careful, and you have been careful for 6 years, and that carefulness has kept your family above water. This man at table 7 is a stranger. You owe him nothing." That was one side of the argument. The other side was quieter and didn't use words so much as sensations. The sensation of watching Anthony's face when he gave the instruction. The casual contempt in his voice when he said the burrata was imported, but it wasn't. The calm, specific cruelty of it, not the cruelty of rage, which was at least human in its heat, but the cruelty of indifference, which was colder, and in Emily's experience, much more dangerous. The sensation of what it felt like to be humiliated by someone who believed you were too small to fight back. She knew what that felt like. Every person who had ever worked for Anthony Russo knew what that felt like. She thought about Rodrigo. She thought about Claire. She thought about Hassan and his subway train. She thought about Marco Bellini, the head chef, who had been at Cassini's for 11 years, and who was by any honest measure a genuinely gifted cook. A man who cared about food the way some people cared about art, and who was right now in that kitchen preparing something he would never in his life choose to prepare. Following an instruction he had never wanted to follow because the alternative was losing the only thing he was good at. Emily reached under the server station and found a notepad. Her handwriting was usually quick and neat. Her hands were not entirely steady at this moment, and the letters came out slightly larger than normal, slightly pressed. "Do not eat this meal. You are being targeted. Trust me." She looked at what she had written. For a long moment she looked at it. Then she tore it off the pad, folded it twice, held it in her palm, and walked to table 7. "Good evening," she said. "My name is Emily. I'll be taking care of you tonight." The man looked up from the menu. Up close, his eyes were darker than she'd realized, and there was something in them that was difficult to name. Not unkindness, not warmth either. Something else, something that felt like attention, like the kind of attention that missed nothing. "Emily," he said. His voice was quiet. The vowels were New York, but smoothed down, controlled the way speech became when someone had spent years deciding very carefully how they wanted to sound. "Can I get you something to drink to start?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Water," he said. Still, "Of course." She smiled the way she had trained herself to smile genuinely, because if you performed a smile, customers felt it, and it produced the opposite effect, and she reached across to adjust his silverware, and she slid the folded note beneath the edge of his bread plate, and she straightened up and walked back to the service station. She did not look back. She did not let herself look back, because if she looked back and he was reading it, or if he had seen her place it, or if his expression had changed, she would not be able to maintain the neutral professional composure that was currently the only thing standing between her and a complete dissolution of everything she had managed to hold together. She went to the service station and filled a glass with still water and told herself to breathe. She brought him his water. He did not look at her differently. He said thank you. She asked if he was ready to hear the specials, and he said yes, and she went through them, and when she mentioned the branzino, he looked at her very steadily and said, "What would you recommend?" "The tagliatelle," she said immediately. "Chef Bellini makes the pasta in-house. It's exceptional tonight." The man looked at her for one beat longer than was strictly necessary. "Tagliatelle," he said. "All right." She wrote it down. She thanked him. She returned to the service station and put the order in and stood very still and realized her hands were shaking. Rosa appeared at her elbow. "You look like you saw a ghost." "I'm fine," Emily said. "Who is that guy at 7? "No idea," Emily said. "Just a customer." She believed that when she said it. 15 minutes later, Anthony materialized at her side. He did it the way he always did, the most important things, without announcement, without approach, simply appearing as though he had been there all along, and she had simply failed to notice. "He ordered the tagliatelle," Anthony said. It was not a question. "He did," Emily said. "He asked for a recommendation." "I told you to recommend the branzino. He asked what I thought was best," Emily said carefully. "I thought the tagliatelle was the honest answer." Anthony's eyes moved over her face. She had been looked at by Anthony Russo many times in 6 years. She knew what that look contained. It contained assessment and calculation, and something that was not quite anger. Anger was too warm for Anthony, but something adjacent to it, something territorial. "Next time," he said quietly, "follow your instructions." "Of course," she said. He walked away. Emily exhaled very slowly through her nose. The man at table 7 ate his tagliatelle. He ate it the way he seemed to do everything quietly without performance paying attention. He did not look around the room excessively. He did not check his phone. He ate with the focused calm of someone who was used to waiting and for whom patience was not an effort but a default state. Emily watched him from across the room, the way servers watched all their tables peripherally without staring. She noticed at one point that he had reached beneath his bread plate and found the folded note and had smoothed it open on his knee below the level of the table where no one walking by would see it. She watched his face. Nothing moved. He read whatever was written there. Her handwriting, her shaking letters, her 4 sentences that had felt like stepping off a cliff, and his expression did not change. Not a flicker, not a tightening around the eyes or a shift in the set of his mouth. He simply read, and then folded the note again and placed it inside his breast pocket and returned to his pasta. And then for just a moment he looked across the room, not sweeping the room the way people do when they're bored or curious. Directly across the room, directly at her. She was looking at a table 2 stations away and pretending not to see him. He held that look for exactly 3 seconds and then returned to his meal. Emily's heart was doing something medically inadvisable. 22 minutes after Michael DeLuca sat down at table 7, 2 men came through the front door of Cassini's. They were not wearing the kind of clothes that made them anonymous. They were wearing expensive suits, dark and well-fitted, and they moved through the restaurant entrance with the particular kind of unhurried authority that people display when they know they will not be told to leave. Sophie at the host station took one look at them and stepped aside without a word. They walked to table 7. The quieter, less assuming part of the room, the part Emily had been trained over 6 years to watch, shifted. It was not dramatic. The other diners did not stop eating. The ambient noise did not drop. But something changed, some quality of the air, the way the air in a room changes when a door opens somewhere and the pressure adjusts. The man at table 7 looked up at the two men. "Mr. DeLuca," one of them said quietly. "We've been asked to check in." The man. Emily had been calling the quiet stranger. The man she had protected with 4 handwritten sentences said, "I know, give me 10 minutes." The two men nodded and stepped back and stood near the far wall. Emily watched Anthony Russo. He was standing near the reservations desk, and he had seen the men come in, and now his face was doing something she had never in 6 years seen it do. The practiced stillness, the controlled authority, the calculated blankness that he wore like a uniform, it had cracked just slightly, just around the edges, the way old plaster cracks when the temperature changes. Anthony Russo looked afraid, not the performed, contained, useful fear of a man managing a difficult situation. Something older and more animal than that. He looked like a man who had just understood that he had made a mistake, and that the mistake was not recoverable. Emily Carter stood in the middle of the floor of Cassini's restaurant at 8:47 in the evening on a Thursday in February, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that the man she had slid a note to under a bread plate was not an ordinary customer. She understood something else too. She had done it anyway. Before she knew, before the men in suits, before the crack in Anthony's armor. She had done it when he was nobody, when he was just a man eating pasta alone on a slow night, when protecting him cost her everything and gained her nothing. She had written the note when all she knew was that something wrong was happening to someone who hadn't done anything to deserve it. She stood on the floor of the restaurant with 3 tables in her section and her hands finally steady, and she thought, whatever happens next, at least that part was mine. Anthony caught her before she reached the service station. He stepped in front of her with a speed that was out of character, out of proportion, the speed of a man who was operating outside his normal rhythms because his normal rhythms were no longer adequate. "What did you do?" he said. It was not a question. His voice was the quietest it had ever been when he spoke to her, and quiet in Anthony's voice was always worse than loud. "I'm not sure what you mean," Emily said. "At table 7, he said. "When you adjusted his silverware." She met his eyes. She held them. "I straightened his fork," she said. "Is that a problem?" "Emily." His voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. The pewter eyes had something in them now. She didn't have a clean word for somewhere between fury and desperation, and the desperation was more frightening. "I need to know exactly what you said to that man. I asked if he wanted to hear the specials," she said. "He asked for a recommendation. I recommended the tagliatelle. He ordered the tagliatelle." She paused. "Is there something wrong with the tagliatelle?" Anthony looked at her. In 6 years, she had never held Anthony Russo's gaze this long, without something inside her shrinking, slightly pulling back the automatic response of someone who has learned that meeting this particular man's eyes costs something. She held it now. She didn't know exactly why. She thought perhaps it was because she had already done the most terrifying thing she could do tonight, and having done it, the other terrifying things had become smaller. "The note," Anthony said. "I'm sorry." "There was a note," he said. "Under his plate. I need to know what it said." Emily felt the floor of her chest drop away. She felt it clearly, the specific internal freefall of someone who has been found out, whose carefully constructed front has been seen through, who is standing in the open with no cover available. She felt that feeling completely, and in its entirety. And then she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Anthony looked at her for a long, still moment. Across the restaurant, The quiet man was signing something on a small card, his check, though Emily couldn't be certain, and the two men in expensive suits were now standing slightly closer to the table, the geometry of the three of them rearranging into something that looked less like a check-in and more like preparation. "You need to be very careful," Anthony said softly. "Do you understand me? This is not a situation you want to be inside." "I understand," Emily said. "I'll be very careful." She walked away from him and went to check on the couple at table 11 who wanted to know if the panna cotta was house-made, and she told them, yes, absolutely, and she smiled the genuine smile she had trained herself to produce, and her hands were steady, and the floor of the restaurant held her, and she thought, I understand exactly what kind of situation this is. I just don't think that's your decision. The quiet man Michael DeLuca. The name was lodging itself in her memory with a weight she didn't entirely understand yet was preparing to leave. He had been at table 7 for 40 minutes. He had eaten his tagliatelle. He had drunk 2 glasses of a red wine she had brought without him needing to ask. She had read the label on the table's wine list and picked something that matched what she had guessed. His preferences might be a habit she had developed with all her tables, and she had guessed correctly because he had looked at the glass with the small, barely perceptible acknowledgement of someone whose expectation has been met. He had at no point during those 40 minutes betrayed by any visible sign that he had read 4 sentences under his bread plate and understood his evening had been planned differently than he'd arranged. He was extraordinarily controlled. Emily recognized that quality because she had spent 6 years developing a lesser version of it. She brought his coat. She had retrieved it from the coat check without being asked because she had seen him glance toward the front of the restaurant and read the intention in it, the small preparatory shift of a person about to organize their exit. He stopped when she appeared at his elbow. He looked at the coat in her hands and then at her face. "Thank you," he said. Not the thank you people said to service staff, the perfunctory syllables of acknowledgement that meant approximately the same thing as not at all, or of course, or I've barely registered you. He said it the way people said it when they meant it specifically and entirely. "You're welcome," Emily said. "I hope you enjoyed your evening." He put on his coat. He looked at her once more, and she had the distinct sensation of being seen very thoroughly and very quickly catalogued the way she catalogued tables, except that whatever he filed away had more dimensions and greater precision than anything she produced. He said the tagliatelle was the right call. Then he walked to the front of the restaurant where the 2 men in suits were waiting, and he left. Emily stood holding the empty coat check ticket. Anthony did not speak to her for the rest of the service. That was how she knew it was bad. Anthony's silence was always more dangerous than his words. His words were the mechanism he used to manage people he believed he could manage. His silence was reserved for situations he was still calculating, still turning over, still deciding how to handle. When Anthony Russo went quiet, something was coming. She had seen it with Rodrigo. She had seen it with Claire. She had seen it with Hassan. She closed out her section at 11. She rolled her silverware. She said goodnight to Rosa and to the busser whose name was Jake and who was 19 and reminded her of Danny in ways that made her chest ache. She got her coat from the staff room. Marco was in the kitchen breaking down his station, and when she passed the kitchen window, she stopped and looked in at him. Marco Bellini, 53 years old, who had been cooking in New York for 30 years, and who made pasta the way his grandmother had taught him when he was 7 in a village outside Salerno, who had been asked tonight to cook something bad on purpose, and had done it because he was afraid. He looked up and saw her through the window. He looked at her the way people look when they know what you know, and neither of you is going to say it out loud. Emily nodded at him once. Marco nodded back. Marco. She walked out of the restaurant into the February cold and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the dark city and felt for the first time in as long as she could remember something that was not quite peace and not quite fear, but something in between, something that tasted like standing on the edge of something very high and realizing you had already jumped. She pulled her coat tighter and walked to the subway. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone in her hand and the city moving around her, and the cold wind coming up from somewhere, and she thought about not answering. She thought about what it would mean to not answer. She thought about her mother's face, and Danny's scholarship, and the sound of Anthony's voice going very quiet. She answered. "Emily Carter," said a voice she recognized. Quiet, controlled. New York vowels smoothed down carefully. "This is Michael DeLuca." She stopped breathing for exactly 2 seconds. "I know," she said. She was surprised by how steady her voice came out. "I have some questions for you," Michael DeLuca said. "Nothing threatening. I want to be clear about that." "All right," she said. "How long have you worked for Anthony Russo?" 6 years, she said. "And tonight, the instruction he gave you, was that unusual for him?" Emily thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the years of watching. She thought about Rodrigo and Claire and Hassan. She thought about Marco's face in the kitchen window. "No," she said quietly. "Tonight wasn't unusual." A brief silence on the other end of the line. "I see," Michael DeLuca said. Another silence, slightly longer. "I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning," he said. "There's a coffee shop on 47th Street, the west side of the block, Blue Door. 9 o'clock. I'll be there." "Why?" Emily asked. "Because," Michael DeLuca said, "you answered the phone. And before that you wrote the note. And before that—" He paused. "You knew who I was when you brought my coat." Emily's throat closed slightly. "No," she said carefully. "I didn't know who you were when I wrote the note." The longest pause yet. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why I'm calling." The line went quiet. Emily stood on the February sidewalk, with the phone pressed against her cold cheek, and the city went on around her in all directions. Taxicabs and delivery bikes, and a couple arguing near the corner. And somewhere down the block, someone laughing very loudly at something. And she thought about what it meant to be called by someone everyone else in that restaurant had been afraid of, and to have been called because she had been the one who wasn't. She had not been unafraid. That was what he didn't know yet. She had been terrified. Every moment of it, from the note to the coat check, she had been afraid in a way that was physical, that lived in her hands and her chest and the base of her throat. She had just decided that the fear wasn't the point. She started walking again. 9 o'clock. Blue Door, 47th Street. She walked down into the subway, and the train came, and she rode it home to her apartment in Astoria, where her mother was asleep in the back bedroom, breathing quietly. And Danny's textbooks were spread across the kitchen table, where he had been studying and had fallen asleep in his chair, his head down on his folded arms, a highlighter still loosely held in his hand. Emily turned off the kitchen light and covered her brother with the blanket from the couch and stood in the dark apartment and listened to the sounds of the building settling around her. She thought about a note. 4 sentences. "Do not eat this meal. You are being targeted. Trust me." She had written the word trust with her unsteady hand and had not known whether she had the right to ask for it, whether it meant anything coming from her, whether the stranger would read it and laugh, or read it and be angry, or simply fold it and put it away, and proceed with his evening as though nothing had happened. She had written it anyway, because some things she had understood since she was old enough to understand anything you did not get to do conditionally. Some things you did, or you didn't do, and the conditions were irrelevant, and the outcome was separate from the choice, and the choice was the only part that was fully and finally yours. She had made hers. Whatever came next, that part was settled. She went to bed. She set her alarm for 7:30. She had a 9 o'clock meeting to get to. The coffee shop on 47th Street had a blue door exactly where he said it would be. Emily arrived at 8:53. She had been awake since 6, which meant she had slept approximately 4.5 hours, which was about what she expected. She had lain in the dark listening to the building and thinking, not in the circular, anxious way that usually accompanied her insomnia, but in the straight, deliberate way of someone who is trying to understand the shape of something before they have to stand inside it. She knew the name Michael DeLuca, the way most people in New York knew it, partially, incompletely, through the specific kind of knowledge that accretes around powerful figures who operate in spaces most people never enter. You heard the name. You heard it attached to other names, other events, other rumors that could never quite be confirmed because the people who confirmed things about Michael DeLuca were people whose confirmations were not available to the general public. You knew he was powerful. You knew the kind of powerful he was. You knew that powerful people of that particular kind existed in New York the way weather existed as a fact of the environment. Something you were aware of and moved around but did not expect to interact with directly. She had interacted with him directly. She pushed open the blue door. He was already there. Of course he was already there. She had the instinct, looking at him sitting at a small table in the back with a cup of coffee, and no phone visible, and no newspaper, no prop of any kind. Just a man sitting and waiting with the profound stillness of someone who did not experience waiting. As wasted time, she had the instinct that Michael DeLuca was always already there. That arriving before other people was not a tactic for him, but simply the natural expression of how he moved through the world. He looked up when she came in. He did not stand. He nodded once, which she read correctly as an acknowledgement and a direction. Both "I see you, come sit," and she unzipped her coat and sat down across from him, and a woman appeared immediately with coffee that Emily hadn't ordered, and she understood that the coffee shop knew him and that the table in the back was arranged the way it was because it was his table. "You slept," he said. It was somewhere between an observation and a question. "A little," she said. He looked at her with that same quality of attention she had catalogued the night before, thorough, fast, missing nothing. "Are you afraid right now?" he asked. The directness of it was startling. She had expected something more gradual pleasantries, context setting some conversational architecture that built toward the real questions. Instead, he had gone straight to the real question on the second sentence, and it was so unexpected that she answered honestly before she had time to calculate. "Yes," she said. "Some," he nodded. "Good," he said. "People who say they're not afraid of me are either lying or they don't understand the situation. You understand the situation." "I'm beginning to," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape a smile would leave behind, if a smile had passed through very quickly without stopping. "Why did you write it?" he said. Not a question. A door he was opening and leaving for her to walk through or not. Emily wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "Because what was happening was wrong," she said. "And I knew it was wrong, and the only person who could do anything about it in that moment was me. You didn't know who I was." "No." "You didn't know if the note would make anything better." "No," she said. "You knew it could cost you your job." "Yes." "Then why?" He said, "Didn't you stay out of it, the way everyone else did?" Emily looked at him across the small table. She thought about how to answer that, whether to answer it the careful way, the way she had answered Anthony the night before, the measured, protected way, or the honest way. She thought about how he had called her the night before and said, "I know you didn't know who I was. That's exactly why I'm calling." She thought about what that sentence meant. She went with honest. "Because I've been looking away my whole career," she said. "And I'm very good at it. I know exactly how to not see things that are happening right in front of me, because seeing them and doing nothing is worse than not seeing them, and the only way to survive not doing anything is to convince yourself you didn't see it." She paused. "But last night, I couldn't do that. I tried. I stood at the service station for 4 minutes trying to find the version of it where it wasn't my problem." She looked at him. "I couldn't find it." Silence. Michael DeLuca looked at her for a long time. Not the assessing look from the restaurant. This was different, more interior, like he was processing something that required more than ordinary attention. 4 minutes, he said finally. "About that," she said. "Most people," he said, "don't spend 4 seconds." He picked up his coffee. He drank. He set it down. "Tell me about Anthony Russo," he said. "Not last night, everything." So she told him. She had not planned to tell him everything. She had told herself on the subway riding in that morning that she would be careful, measured that she would answer what he asked, and not volunteer more than he needed, that she would remember. She did not know this man, and he did not know her. And good intentions on both sides were not the same as trust. She had planned to be precise and contained. Instead, she talked for almost 40 minutes. She told him about Rodrigo and the scheduling error, and the 3 weeks of systematic humiliation that followed before Rodrigo finally resigned. She told him about Claire, the hostess, who had been 22 and excellent at her job, and had made one seating error during a Saturday rush, and had been publicly corrected in front of the entire dining room loudly enough for customers to hear, and who had come back the following Monday, visibly different, quieter, smaller, moving through the restaurant with the careful, minimized movements of someone who had been taught that taking up space was dangerous. She told him about Hassan and his subway train, and how Anthony had written him up twice in a week for tardiness, and used those write-ups to negotiate his overtime pay down the following month in a move so clean and so technically within the restaurant's written policies that Hassan had no recourse at all. She told him about Marco. This part she had not expected to tell him. Marco Bellini had been at Cassini's for 11 years. Marco Bellini made pasta the way people wrote music, with his whole attention, with the specific joy of someone doing the thing they were born to do. Marco had a daughter in college in Philadelphia, and a mother in a care facility in Brooklyn, and a mortgage on an apartment in Flushing. And Anthony Russo knew all three of those things, had made it his business to know them and use them as quietly and efficiently as a man might use a set of keys to open whatever door he needed opened. When Emily told Michael about Marco being instructed to prepare the bad meal, something shifted in Michael's face. Not dramatically. Just a slight adjustment around the eyes, a very small tightening that she was close enough to see. "He followed the instruction," Michael said. "He did," Emily said. "Because he was scared. Because Anthony had made sure he was scared. And you." "I was scared too," she said. "But you didn't follow the instruction." "No." Michael was quiet. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the saucer. It was the first time she had seen him make an unnecessary movement, and something about it made him seem more human in a way that she hadn't been prepared for. "How many employees at Cassini's?" he said. 17 full-time, Emily said. 8 part-time. "How many of them would describe a situation similar to what you've described?" Emily thought about it honestly. "All of them," she said. "In different ways, with different specifics. But all of them." Michael nodded slowly. "One more question," he said. She waited. "Last night," he said. "When you brought my coat, you knew by then." "Yes," she said. "You had figured out who I was." "I had figured out that you were someone Anthony was afraid of," she said. "I didn't know the specifics yet, but I understood the category." "And you still brought the coat." "You were leaving," she said simply. "You needed your coat." He looked at her. She looked back. "Emily," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name since the phone call, and there was something in the way he said it that was different from how Anthony said her name, which was always with the slight inflection of ownership, the manager's proprietary claim. Michael DeLuca said her name like it was a complete sentence, like it was a fact he was acknowledging. "I'm going to ask you to do something. You're going to want to say no. I want you to hear the whole thing before you do." Her hands tightened around the coffee cup. "All right," she said. "I want you to go to work tonight," he said. "I want you to work your section. I want you to behave exactly as you behaved yesterday, exactly with no deviation. Nothing that tells Anthony or anyone else that this conversation happened. Can you do that?" "Why?" she said. "Because there are things I need to put in place before anything changes at that restaurant," he said. "And I need 24 hours, and I need Anthony to believe that last night landed no differently for you than any other night." Emily thought about walking back into Cassini's that evening. She thought about Anthony's quiet voice asking her what she had done. She thought about the crack in his face when the men in suits had walked in. "He suspects me already," she said. "I know," Michael said. "That's why it has to be you who goes back and not someone I send." "If you don't go back, he knows. If you go back and act normally, he's left with a suspicion he can't confirm. And if he pushes harder than suspicion? Michael looked at her directly. He won't, he said. Not tonight. He has other things occupying his attention this morning. He paused. I made a phone call at 6 a.m. Emily absorbed that. What does that mean for him? It means... Michael said that Anthony Russo spent the night understanding that certain assumptions he has made about his position are not as secure as he believed. He is not going to spend tonight antagonizing you. He is going to spend tonight being very careful and very quiet because he knows someone is watching. And tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow. Michael said, things at that restaurant are going to change. The word tomorrow hung in the air between them. Emily heard all the things it contained, all the specifics that he wasn't giving her, all the machinery that was apparently already moving behind the scenes of her ordinary working life, all the things that had been set in motion by 4 sentences written with shaking hands. And me, she said. What happens to me in this situation? For the first time, Michael DeLuca looked at her with something that was explicitly and unmistakably human. Not the assessing attention, not the controlled stillness, but something that had a temperature. Warm wasn't the right word for it. Warm was too simple, too easy. It was the look of a man who had spent a very long time in a world where people's actions were almost entirely explainable by self-interest, and who was now sitting across from someone whose actions were not, and who was trying to reconcile those two things. Nothing bad, he said. You have my word. Your word, Emily said carefully, is something I can't assess very well. I don't know you. I know your name, and I know what people say about it, and what people say about it is not the kind of thing that makes you have my word feel like a settlement. He didn't flinch. If anything, his expression shifted very slightly towards something that might have been respect. Fair, he said. What I can tell you, he continued, is that I have been in rooms with a great many people in my life. People who have reason to want things from me. People who need things and are trying to position themselves to get them. He stopped. You sat down across from me this morning, knowing what you know about my name, and told me you were afraid. You told me you spent 4 minutes at the service station trying to find a version of events where it wasn't your problem. You did not try to tell me you were brave. You did not try to build a version of yourself that would be useful to me. He paused. That is more honest than most of the conversations I have had in the last decade. Emily held very still. I protect people who extend me that kind of honesty, Michael said. Not out of sentiment, because it's valuable, and because it's rare. She thought about her mother in the back bedroom. She thought about Danny's highlighter fallen loose in his sleeping hand. All right, she said. I'll go in tonight. He nodded once. She stood and put on her coat. He did not stand, which she was grateful for. The formality of it would have felt wrong, too much weight on a moment she needed to carry lightly to get through the rest of the day. Emily, he said as she was turning to leave. She stopped. The note, he said. Where did you learn to do that? Take a risk like that. Quietly. She thought about her mother at 29, working double shifts at a hospital laundry in Queens, sending Emily to school in shoes that were too small because she had refused to let Emily know the shoes were too small until Emily had grown out of them entirely and her feet hurt. Thought about her mother saying when Emily was 11, you do what's right, and then you figure out the rest. My mother, Emily said. She pushed through the blue door into the February cold. She had 8 hours before her shift. She spent 2 of them sitting with her mother, who was having a good morning, clearer than usual. The left side of her face, less heavy. Her speech more fluid, and they drank tea. And her mother talked about a dream she'd had about a garden, and Emily listened and said yes. And really. And that sounds beautiful. And did not say anything about the coffee shop, or the blue door, or the man with the dark eyes who had told her she was more honest than most of the conversations he'd had in a decade. There was no version of that conversation she could have with her mother right now that would not frighten her. So she drank her tea and listened to the dream about the garden, And at one point her mother looked at her with the direct, penetrating look that mothers sometimes produce without warning, the look that bypasses everything you've constructed and lands directly on what's underneath it, and said, "Emily, what's going on with you?" "Nothing, Mom," Emily said. Her mother looked at her for another moment. "You look like you made a decision," she said. Emily thought about 4 sentences written with shaking hands. She thought about a man who had read them without his face changing. She thought about 24 hours and what they contained. "I think I did," she said. Her mother nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she understood more than she was being told. "Was it the right one?" Emily looked at her hands around the teacup. "I think so," she said. "I hope so." "Then stop worrying about it," her mother said. "The right ones always feel scary. That's how you know." Emily squeezed her mother's hand. Her mother's hand was thinner than it used to be and warmer than she expected, and Emily held on for a beat longer than she normally would. She went to work, too. She arrived at Cassini's at 4:45 for the 5 o'clock pre-service meeting. She hung up her coat. She put on her apron. She checked her section. She went through the specials with Marco, who looked at her from across the pass-through with an expression she had no simple name for, something compounded from gratitude and guilt, and the specific relief of a man who has been carrying something heavy alone and is not entirely sure he's allowed to put it down yet. She nodded at him. He nodded back. Anthony came in at 5:15. He was wearing what he always wore, dark suit, white shirt, no tie, and he moved through the restaurant in the deliberate, proprietary way he always moved. But something was different. The difference was subtle enough that most people wouldn't have clocked it, but Emily had spent 6 years watching this man the way you watch weather systems. Not because you wanted to, but because your safety required you to know what was building. He was slower today. Not dramatically slower. Fractionally. The way a clock runs fractionally slow when its battery is beginning to fail. Functioning normally to all appearances, but off by just enough that if you put it next to a clock that was running correctly, you'd feel the difference. He came through the dining room and stopped at the service station where Emily was filling salt shakers. He stood next to her for a moment without speaking. She kept filling salt shakers. "Good evening," he said finally. "Good evening," she said. "Busy service tonight," he said. "We're at 90%. A reservation came in this afternoon. Party of 6, 8 o'clock. "I'll be ready," she said. He stood there another moment. She felt him looking at her the way she felt weather, not with her eyes, but with some other sense, some older animal awareness. "Last night," he said. She kept filling salt shakers. She did not look up. "What about it?" "I want to be sure we understand each other," he said. "I think we understand each other fine," she said mildly. A pause. "Good," he said. He walked away. Emily set down the salt shaker and breathed out through her nose very slowly and noticed that her hands were not shaking. She found that interesting. The night before writing the note they had shaken. Standing in front of Anthony now, they were steady. She thought maybe this is what it feels like when the worst thing has already happened and you've survived it. Everything after that is just consequence. Service began. It was a busy night, as Anthony had said, and Emily worked with the focused physical efficiency of someone who had spent 6 years developing an extremely specific set of skills. She moved through her section without waste. She read her tables with the accuracy she had always read them, adjusting her approach, her pace, her language, the amount of space she gave each conversation. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. At 7:43, a man came in alone and asked for the bar. He was in his late 40s, wearing a coat she didn't recognize the brand of, but recognized the quality of a coat that suggested a certain level of resources without advertising them. He sat at the far end of the bar. He ordered a Negroni. He sat with his Negroni and looked at the room with the mild, unhurried interest of someone who was comfortable and in no hurry. Emily noticed him. She noticed him the way she had noticed Michael DeLuca, not because of anything he did, but because of the quality of his stillness. People who are truly watching something go very still in a way that's different from people who are simply resting. It's a productive stillness rather than a restful one. He was watching the restaurant, more specifically, and she worked this out over the next 20 minutes while managing her section with one part of her attention and tracking the man at the bar with another. He was watching Anthony. At 8:02, a second man she didn't recognize came in and sat at a high top near the window. He also ordered a drink. He also did not look at his phone. Emily understood what was happening. She understood it with a calmness that surprised her. Michael DeLuca had told her that he had made a phone call at 6 a.m. He had told her Anthony would be occupied with other concerns. He had not told her that other concerns included two men in the restaurant she worked in, watching her manager with the attentive stillness of people who were there to gather information, not to eat. She was standing inside a operation she could not fully see the shape of. That should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, she refilled a water glass and smiled at a woman celebrating her birthday, and brought a second bread basket to the party of 6 who had arrived at 8 and were loud in the pleasant, harmless way of people celebrating something and wanted nothing more demanding from her than efficiency and warmth. She gave them both. At 9:15, Anthony left the floor. This was unusual. Anthony rarely left during service. He might retreat to his office for 10 minutes to handle something administrative, but he kept himself visible during service hours, part of the control mechanism, the constant presence that reminded everyone he was watching. When he left at 9:15, the quality of the room shifted very slightly, the way rooms shifted when a particular kind of pressure was lifted. Rosa appeared at Emily's elbow. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Emily said. "Tony just went in the back," Rosa said. "He looked terrible, like he'd seen a ghost." "I'm sure it's nothing," Emily said. Rosa gave her a look. Rosa had been at Cassini's for 4 years, which was long enough to have developed her own reliable weather sense about Anthony. "It's not nothing," she said. "Something's happening." "We have 3 tables that need checking," Emily said. "Let's focus." Rosa shook her head slightly, but moved back to her section. Emily went to check on the birthday table. At 9:41, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She had it on silent, which she always did during service, and she felt the vibration and did not check it until she had a moment at the service station with no immediate demands on her attention. Unknown number. Text message. 2 words. "Go home." She read it twice. She looked at the back of the restaurant where Anthony's office was. She looked at the 2 men, one at the bar, one at the high top, who were still there, still unhurried, still giving the restaurant their quiet, total attention. She looked at Marco through the kitchen window. He caught her eye. She mouthed, "You okay?" He nodded slowly. She put her phone back in her apron pocket and went to the birthday table to ask if they wanted to see the dessert menu. They did. They ordered 4 desserts and a round of dessert wines and were delighted by everything. Emily stood at their table and absorbed their delight, the way she absorbed everything tonight, with full attention, and a portion of herself held slightly separate, watching, listening, waiting. At 10:20, Anthony came back out. He had been gone for over an hour. He looked like a man who had made a phone call he wished he hadn't had to make. He looked like a man who had been told something he had suspected was coming, but had hoped would not arrive tonight. The pewter eyes were flatter than usual. The deliberate walk had lost some of its weight. He did not look at Emily. He stood at the front of the restaurant and looked at the room, and then he went to the bar and said something to the man in the quality coat very quietly, just a few words. The man at the bar looked up at him without expression. He said something back. Anthony straightened, walked to the high top near the window and said something to the second man. Same response. Same expressionless attention. Anthony walked back to the middle of the floor and stood there for a moment. That was slightly too long a man in a space that had begun to feel like it no longer belonged to him, with no obvious move available. Then he turned and went back to his office. Emily watched all of this and felt something she had not expected to feel, something that sat uncomfortably alongside everything else she was carrying tonight. She felt sorry for him. Not in a way that erased what he had done to Rodrigo and Claire and Hassan and Marco and all the others. She hadn't named all the small and grinding cruelties of 9 years that had built the ecology of fear inside Cassini's into something so normalized that the employees had stopped recognizing it as remarkable. She did not feel sorry for him in a way that mitigated any of that. But she felt sorry for him in the simple human way that she sometimes felt sorry for people who had organized their entire existence around a particular kind of power and were watching that power become unavailable to them. It was not a comfortable way to live. She knew that. She had watched it from the underside for 6 years. Service ended. The last table left at 11:15. The staff broke down their sections, rolled silverware, did the final tasks of closing with the low-grade exhaustion that settled over restaurant workers at the end of a long service like weather. Rosa was talking to Jake about something. The 2 men bar high top had left at separate times between 10 and 11, and Emily had not seen them leave, had only registered their absence the way you registered when a sound stopped. She got her coat. She said goodnight to Rosa and Jake. She went to the kitchen window. Marco was alone finishing his breakdown. He looked up when he heard her. "You doing okay?" she said. He looked at her. His face was tired and complicated. "Emily," he said. "What did you do?" She held his gaze. "What did I do?" "Last night," he said. "With that man." "I served him his dinner," she said carefully. Marco shook his head. Not in disbelief. In the way people shook their heads when they had already worked something out and didn't need confirmation, but were still adjusting to the reality of it. "The 2 guys tonight," he said. "At the bar and the window." "I noticed them," she said. "Tony's scared," Marco said. Very quiet, very direct. "I know," she said. Marco looked at her for a long moment. 11 years of early mornings and long services, and a daughter in Philadelphia, and his mother in Brooklyn, and a kitchen he loved more than he would comfortably admit. 11 years of following instructions, because the alternative was losing the one thing that gave his life its shape. "Is it going to be okay?" he said. And he said it with the specific vulnerability of a man who had run out of pride for the question, who needed to ask it more than he needed to protect himself from the asking. Emily thought about a blue door on 47th Street. She thought about a man who had told her things would change tomorrow. She thought about her mother saying the right ones always feel scary. "Yes," she said. "I think it's going to be okay." Marco nodded. He looked down at his station. He picked up a cloth and began wiping down a surface that was already clean. Emily walked out of the restaurant and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the city. Her phone buzzed. Same unknown number. Another text. "Thank you for going back. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Same place." She put the phone in her pocket. She stood for another moment on the sidewalk and looked up at the sky above the buildings, which in New York was never fully dark, always that particular bruised orange of a city that had made a decision to keep the lights on permanently, to refuse the dark, its dominance. She thought about Anthony and his office. She thought about what he knew and what he didn't know, and what was coming toward him that he was only beginning to understand. She thought about the 2 men who had sat in his restaurant all evening, watching him with the focused, patient attention of people who worked for someone who had made a phone call at 6 in the morning. She thought about what it must feel like to spend 9 years building something out of fear, and then to sit in your office and understand that the thing you had built had no foundation under it at all. That it had only ever rested on the belief that nobody would look closely enough, or care enough, or be brave enough to make it move. She thought about 4 sentences. The shaking hands. The 4 minutes at the service station. She thought about Danny asleep at the kitchen table with his highlighter in his hand, and her mother's dream about a garden, and the specific weight of someone else's life held in your hands, and the decision you made about whether to hold it carefully or set it down. She walked to the subway. She went home. She set her alarm for 7:30. Whatever tomorrow contained, and she understood now that it contained more than she had access to, that she was standing at the visible edge of something that extended a very long way into territory. She couldn't see whatever it contained. She had agreed to meet it. That was the only thing she could do from here. The city went on above her as the train moved underground, and she held the overhead bar and felt the sway and clatter of it. The specific rhythm of New York in motion. Never stopping. Never fully resting. Always carrying people toward the next thing they had agreed to face. And she let it carry her home. She was at the Blue Door at 8:51, 2 minutes earlier than yesterday, which she noticed and found mildly interesting as a data point about what 24 hours of accumulated tension did to a person's relationship with punctuality. She had slept better than she expected. Not well, not fully, but the kind of sleep that comes when a body has simply run out of the energy required to stay anxious and surrenders into unconsciousness as a practical matter. She had woken at 6:40 without the alarm and lain still for a few minutes, listening to the apartment, her mother's quiet breathing through the wall, the early sounds of the city beginning its daily argument with itself, and she had felt something she identified after a moment as readiness. Not eagerness, not confidence, just the specific quality of a person who has decided something and is prepared to stand in that decision regardless of what it costs. She pushed through the Blue Door. He was already there. Same table, same coffee already poured. The woman appeared immediately with a cup for Emily and disappeared without a word. Michael looked up when she sat down. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the previous morning, that fast, thorough inventory that missed nothing, and whatever he found there seemed to satisfy some internal question he had been holding, because something in his posture settled almost imperceptibly. "You went back?" he said. "You asked me to," she said. "People agree to things in coffee shops," he said, "and then find reasons not to follow through." "I didn't find a reason," she said. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the saucer, the same small gesture she had noticed yesterday, the one that made him human. "Anthony," he said. "How was he?" She told him. All of it. The fractional slowness, the 5:15 arrival, the salt shakers, and the quiet voice asking her if they understood each other, the hour in the office, the two men he had spoken to, the return with the flatter eyes, and the weight gone out of his walk. Michael listened without interrupting. He listened the way she suspected he did, everything with complete attention, nothing divided, as though what she was saying was the only thing in the world currently requiring processing. When she finished, he said, "Did he make any contact with you after the conversation at the service station?" "No," she said. "Did he seem to connect you specifically to the presence of my people in the restaurant?" "I don't think so," she said. "He had other things taking up his attention." She paused. "What did your 6 a.m. phone call actually do to him?" Michael looked at her. "It informed certain people who have a financial relationship with that restaurant that their financial relationship was under review," he said, "and that the review was connected to Anthony's management practices." Emily absorbed that. "How many people?" "3, he said. "The 3 people whose continued goodwill Anthony believed was his primary insurance policy." She thought about that. She thought about a man who had spent 9 years constructing a system of protection, layer upon layer, power, reinforcing power, and what it felt like to have someone reach behind all of it and quietly remove the foundation. "That's why he was in his office for an hour," she said. "Yes," Michael said. "He was making calls," she said, "trying to find out how bad it was." "And finding out," Michael said simply, "that it was worse than he thought." A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that happens between people who are thinking through the same set of facts and don't need to narrate the process to each other. Then Emily said, "What happens today?" Michael set down his coffee cup. He looked at her directly. "This morning," he said, "the ownership of Cassini's will receive documentation. Financial records management reports, personnel files. The kind of documentation that makes certain patterns very clear to people who might previously have preferred not to look closely." "The ownership?" Emily said carefully. "Who is that?" Michael looked at her steadily. "A holding company," he said, "that reports to a board, that has until recently operated under the assumption that Anthony Russo was running a clean, profitable restaurant, and that the details of his management style were an internal matter." And now they're not operating under that assumption, Emily said. They're operating under a different set of facts, he said. Emily sat with that. She was smart enough to hear what he was not saying, that the documentation had been assembled quickly, that the holding company was perhaps not entirely independent of the kind of influence Michael DeLuca was in a position to exert, that the phrase, certain patterns becoming clear, meant those patterns had been made clear by someone with the access and the motivation to make them clear. She was smart enough to hear all of that. She was also smart enough to understand that the result, Anthony Russo being held accountable for 9 years of systematic cruelty, was something that had not been going to happen any other way. The machinery that produced accountability in situations like this was rarely clean. She had known that for a long time. What about the people he hurt, she said. Rodrigo, Claire, the others. That's a more complicated question, Michael said. Some of them I can locate. Some of them may have no interest in reopening that chapter. Some of them may want something I can actually provide. And Marco, she said. He's still there. I know, Michael said. I want to talk about Marco. She waited. What I'm about to tell you, Michael said, is going to sound like I've made decisions without consulting you. I want to acknowledge that up front. Emily said nothing. She held very still. Marco Bellini has worked at Cassini's for 11 years, Michael said. He is by any honest assessment an exceptional chef who has spent a decade having his capabilities underutilized and his judgment compromised because of the person managing him. He made a bad choice 2 nights ago. He made it because he was afraid. That's the entire story of that choice. He paused. I'd like Marco to stay. I'd like him to be protected. And I'd like the thing that happened 2 nights ago to be the last time in his career that someone uses what he loves against him. Emily's chest did something complicated. She had not cried in front of this man. She was not going to cry in front of this man. But the specific relief of hearing someone else say that, say it plainly without softening it or qualifying it, say it as though it were simply true and simply worth saying, was more intense than she'd been prepared for. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, Michael said. We're about to get to the part you're going to push back on. She looked at him. All right? He was quiet for a moment. She noticed it, the pause before something significant, the gathering of words that had been arranged already but were being presented in a particular order for a reason. I want you to take Anthony's position, he said. General manager of Cassini's, starting next week. The coffee shop went very quiet around Emily. Not actually quiet. There were other people, ambient sound, the city doing what the city always did outside the windows. But in the space between her ears, everything simplified down to those 2 sentences. I'm a waitress, she said. You're someone who has been managing people's experiences, reading rooms, mediating conflicts, and maintaining the functioning of a complex operation under actively hostile conditions for 6 years, Michael said. The title has been wrong. The job hasn't. I've never run a restaurant, she said. Anthony Russo ran a restaurant into a culture of fear for 9 years, Michael said. I'm not looking for someone who knows how to run a restaurant. I can hire people who know how to run a restaurant. I'm looking for someone who knows how to treat people. He paused. That is apparently much harder to find. Emily looked at her hands on the table. They were steady. She noticed that and filed it away. There would be a salary, Michael said. He named a number. She looked up. The number was 3 times what she currently made. Her mother's hospital bills, Danny's tuition, the mortgage-adjacent weight of the life she had been holding together with the specific, exhausting ingenuity of someone who had no margin for error. All of it rearranged by a number said aloud in a coffee shop. Why me? She said. It came out quieter than she intended. Because, Michael said, 3 nights ago I walked into a restaurant specifically to test what happened when nobody thought anyone important was watching. And the only person in that restaurant who behaved as though the right thing still mattered, regardless of who was watching, was a waitress with shaking hands who spent 4 minutes trying to talk herself out of it and then did it anyway. He met her eyes. That's not a small thing, Emily. In my experience, that's an extremely rare thing. She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about something her mother had said when she was maybe 14, during a period when life had been particularly hard, and Emily had come home from school exhausted by the specific cruelty that 14-year-olds were capable of, and had said, "Why does it matter if I'm good, when good people just get hurt?" And her mother had looked at her with those clear, tired eyes and said, "Because the alternative is becoming someone you don't recognize. That's the only reason. It's enough." She thought about that. She thought about Anthony's office, and the crack in his face, and the man she had felt briefly sorry for on a sidewalk at 11 at night. She thought about Marco wiping down a clean surface with a cloth. "I have conditions," she said. Something moved through Michael's expression, quick and unmistakable. Satisfaction, not the satisfaction of getting what you wanted, but the satisfaction of having read something correctly. "Tell me," he said. "Marco stays," she said. "His position is protected. Whatever happened 2 nights ago is closed. Nobody holds it over him, nobody references it, nobody uses it. It's done." "Agreed," Michael said immediately. "The staff who are currently there, the ones Anthony has been working on, they get a transition period. Nobody gets let go in the first 60 days without my direct approval. I need to assess what happened to people under him before I make any personnel decisions." "Agreed," Michael said. "I want to know who owns the restaurant," she said. "Not the holding company, not the board. The real answer." Michael looked at her. She looked back. "You're looking at him," he said quietly. She absorbed that. She had suspected it had worked toward it through the logic of what he'd told her. The 6 a.m. phone call. The documentation the board that had preferred not to look closely until someone made them. But suspecting something and having it confirmed were different experiences, and she took a moment with the confirmation. "So when you offered me the position," she said slowly, "you weren't offering me a position with a company." "No," he said. "You were offering me a job working for you." "Yes," he said. "And I want you to understand what that means before you accept. I'm not in a clean business, Emily. I am not going to pretend to you that I am. The restaurant is legitimate. It's run legitimately. It makes legitimate money. It employs legitimate people. But the man who owns it is not a simple man, and knowing his name means you are inside a circle that has consequences." The directness of it hit her like cold water. She had not expected him to say it that plainly. She had expected careful language, the kind of language that communicated risk without naming it. "And yet you're telling me," she said. "Because you asked," he said. "And because you have a right to know what you're choosing." He paused. "The question is whether knowing it changes your answer." She thought about that for a long time. Longer than the previous decisions, the note, the phone call the second morning at the coffee shop. This was different in scale, different in permanence. The note had been a moment. This was a direction. She thought about her mother saying the right ones always feel scary. She thought about Rodrigo, Claire, Hassan, Marco's cloth wiping a clean surface. She thought about 17 full-time employees and 8 part-time, every one of them carrying some version of what it cost to survive under someone who had made fear his primary management tool. "It doesn't change my answer," she said. "But I need you to understand something too." "Tell me," he said. "If I take this position," she said, "I run it my way. Not because I'm ungrateful, and not because I don't understand the situation, but because the only version of this where it works is if I'm actually the one making the decisions about how that restaurant operates. If you need me to be a manager in name while someone else is making the real calls, then this conversation ends here and we both go on with our lives." Michael DeLuca sat across from her and looked at her with an expression that had moved beyond the controlled stillness into something more open, more unguarded than anything she had seen from him in 2 mornings of conversation. "Emily," he said, "that is precisely what I need." She nodded once. "Then yes," she said. "I'll take it." He extended his hand across the table. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and entirely without performance. "There's one more thing," he said as she was releasing his hand. She waited. "This afternoon," he said. Anthony is going to be called in. He's going to be told that his employment is terminated. He's going to be given certain information about why, and he's going to understand that the information originated from an internal source. He paused. He will likely suspect you. He already suspects me, she said. Yes. But suspecting is different from knowing. After today, the gap between those two things gets smaller. He looked at her steadily. I want you to be prepared for that. What does being prepared for it look like? She said. It looks like not being alone in that restaurant tonight, he said. I'll have people nearby. Not in the room, you won't see them, and Anthony won't see them, but they'll be close. If anything shifts in a direction, it shouldn't they respond. The matter-of-fact quality of how he said it was almost more unsettling than the content. People nearby. They respond. The vocabulary of a world that operated with different parameters than the one she had been living in. All right, she said. Are you afraid? He said. Same question as yesterday. Same directness. Yes, she said. Same answer. He nodded. Good, he said. Same word as yesterday, but today it landed differently, heavier, with something she hadn't fully understood the first time, not approval, not dismissal. Something closer to kinship, the recognition of a shared quality between two people who had arrived at it by entirely different roads. She left the coffee shop at 9:37. She walked 3 blocks before she found a bench and sat down, not because she needed to rest, but because she needed 20 seconds of stillness that didn't require her to hold herself together for anyone else's benefit. She sat on the bench and looked at the people moving past a woman with a stroller. 2 men in construction gear carrying coffee, a teenager with headphones looking at a phone, and felt the specific vertigo of being inside an event that had not finished happening yet, of being a person whose life was in the process of becoming something different than it had been 72 hours ago. She had taken the job. She sat with that. Her phone buzzed. Danny. She answered. Hey. Hey, her brother said. His voice was morning rough, still waking up. Mom wants to know if you're coming home for lunch. Probably not, she said. Tell her I'll be home by 3. You okay? Danny said. He was 19 and preoccupied with his own enormous life. But he had her mother's instinct, the ability to hear through the surface of a voice to whatever was underneath it. I'm good, she said. Actually good, not performing good. A pause. What happened? I'll tell you tonight, she said. She went home. She sat with her mother for 2 hours. She did not tell her mother about the coffee shop, or the job, or Michael DeLuca, but she told her that things were going to change, that the situation at work had shifted in a significant way, that she thought she was careful about the word thought, did not want to promise what she couldn't guarantee. She thought things were going to be better. Her mother looked at her for a long moment and said, How much better? Emily named the salary figure. Her mother's face did something that Emily had not seen in over a year. A full, unguarded, uncomplicated expression of relief. It moved across her face like light moving across a room when someone opens the curtains, sudden and complete. Emily, her mother said. It's real, Emily said. I accepted this morning. Her mother reached for her hand and held it the way she had held it when Emily was small. Both hands completely, the specific grip of a parent who wants to communicate something that words don't fully reach. They sat like that for a while. Emily arrived at Cassini's at 4:30. Half an hour earlier than her usual arrival, which meant she was there before most of the other staff, before the pre-service energy had built in the quiet hour when the restaurant existed in the mode it occupied between services cleaned and reset tables. Set the particular stillness of a space that was prepared for people, but not yet inhabited by them. She was in the process of reviewing her section when she heard it. The voices from Anthony's office were not loud. The walls of Cassini's were thick and old, and absorbed sound efficiently. But the door was not fully closed. Someone had let it drift an inch or two from the frame, and through that gap came the low, strained sound of a conversation that was not going well for at least one of the participants. She recognized Anthony's voice. She did not recognize the other voice or voices. There seemed to be 2 of them, both male, both even in a way that suggested practiced control of a kind she was now familiar with. She went to the service station and stood there and did not move toward the office. Rosa arrived at 4:45 and read Emily's face immediately. "What's happening?" she said low. "I don't know," Emily said, which was true enough. Rosa looked at the office door, looked back at Emily. "Tony's been in there since I walked by 20 minutes ago," she said. "There are 2 men with him I've never seen before." "Go set up your section," Emily said quietly. Rosa hesitated. "Emily?" "Please," Emily said. "Go set up your section." Rosa went. At 5:03, the office door opened. The 2 men came out first. They were not the same men who had been at the bar, and the high top the previous evening, different men, but sharing that quality of controlled, patient attention. They walked across the dining room floor toward the front of the restaurant without looking at Emily or Rosa or Jake, who had arrived at 4:50 and was now standing very still near the coat check watching. Anthony came out behind them. He was carrying his coat, not wearing it, carrying it over one arm the way you carried a coat when someone had handed it to you and you hadn't had time to put it on properly because the ending had been faster than you expected. He looked older than he had looked 24 hours ago. Not dramatically older, not the movie version of someone being broken, all visible collapse and surrender. Subtler than that. The way people aged in the face when something they had built their identity around had been taken from them, and the face was left trying to find a structure that didn't depend on the thing that was gone. He crossed the dining room. He stopped when he reached Emily. She held still. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She stood her ground in the exact space she was occupying and met his eyes. The pewter eyes were different now. Still controlled, still careful. This was a man who had been controlling himself for so long that the habit was deeper than whatever was happening to him right now. But underneath the control, there was something naked, something that had been exposed by the removal of everything he had constructed above it. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You," he said, very quiet, almost no inflection, just the word directed at her, carrying everything he hadn't been told but had worked out. She didn't answer. 6 years, he said. 6 years and I never saw it. She still didn't answer. She didn't know what she would have said. There was no version of this conversation she had scripted because she hadn't known how it would land, how it would feel to stand here with this man and have him understand what had happened. She had thought it might feel like victory. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something long, and the end of long things had their own specific gravity that was distinct from triumph. "You're better at this than I thought," he said. Still quiet, still almost without inflection. And then, after a pause that lasted just long enough to feel deliberate, "You'll need to be, for what comes next." He walked past her to the front door and pushed it open and was gone. Emily stood in the middle of the dining room and felt the space he had left. Not the sentimental kind of space that absence opened, not grief, not nostalgia, nothing that generous. But the spatial reality of a room from which something heavy had been removed, the adjustment your body made when a particular weight was no longer pressing. Rosa appeared at her elbow. Her voice was barely above a breath. "Did he just get fired?" "Yes," Emily said. A silence. "Are you okay?" Rosa said. Emily thought about it honestly. "I think so," she said. "I think I will be." Service began an hour later because the world did not pause for significant moments, and reservations had been made, and people were hungry, and the machine of the restaurant moved forward on its own momentum. Emily worked her section. She was, as she always was, good at it. The reading of tables, the adjustments, the specific attentiveness that had been her primary survival tool for 6 years, and was now, she understood, going to be asked to do something larger. Marco cooked. She could hear him through the kitchen window, the cadence of his instructions to the line, the occasional precise correction, the sound of a man who was in his element and knew it, and was tonight. For some reason, she could see even from a distance, cooking with a lightness that hadn't been there before. as though something that had been sitting on his shoulders had shifted. At 7:45, her phone vibrated in her apron pocket. She checked it during a moment between tables. Michael. Not a text. A call. She stepped near the coat check where the ambient noise was slightly lower and answered. "How are things?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Service is running. He left cleanly." "I know," Michael said. "I want to tell you something that happened this afternoon. After Anthony left the restaurant, he made a call to a man named Victor Hale." The name landed on her like a drop of cold water. She didn't know the name. She had no reason to know it. But something in the way Michael said it, the precise, weighted quality of it, told her that the name mattered, and that the fact that Anthony had said it mattered, and that she was now connected to whatever the name contained, whether she had wanted to be or not. "Who is Victor Hale?" she said. "Someone who has been trying to acquire interests in several properties I control for the past 18 months, Michael said. "He has not been successful. He is not the kind of man who takes lack of success easily." "And Anthony called him," Emily said. "Anthony and Victor have a relationship I wasn't fully aware of," Michael said. "That is my error. I should have known. I didn't." A pause. "Victor now knows about you." The coat check area was very quiet. Emily stood in it and felt the particular stillness that came when information arrived that required a moment of full processing before a response was possible. "What does he know?" she said. "He knows you're the internal source. He knows Anthony is gone. He knows I've offered you the manager position." Another pause. "He knows your name." "How does he know I'm the source?" she said. "Anthony only suspected." "Anthony told him he suspected you," Michael said. "That was enough for Victor to act on." Emily thought about what act on meant in that sentence. She thought about what she was standing inside right now, the invisible geometry of it, the lines of force she couldn't fully see. "What does he want?" she said. "He wants leverage," Michael said. "He wants something that gives him pressure on me. People connected to me give him that pressure if they're in a vulnerable enough position. And I'm in a vulnerable enough position," she said. "You were," Michael said. "I'm working on changing that." He paused. "But I want you to know about Victor now because knowing late is more dangerous than knowing early. If he makes contact with you in person through someone else, any way at all, you call me immediately. You don't engage, you don't respond, you just call." "What does making contact look like?" she said. "You'll know," Michael said quietly. "It won't be subtle. Victor Hale does not do subtle." She thought about Anthony's last words to her. "You'll need to be, for what comes next." He hadn't been threatening her. He had been telling her something true, and the something true was connected to this phone call, to the name she was hearing for the first time, to the machinery that had been set in motion and was now moving in directions she didn't control. "Michael," she said. "Yes. When you walked into Cassini's 3 nights ago," she said, "to test what happened when nobody important was watching. Did you know this was going to happen? All of it." A silence on the other end, longer than his usual pauses. "No," he said. "I expected to confirm what I suspected about Anthony and act on it. I expected the restaurant to be a clean operation by the following week." Another pause. "I did not expect you." She absorbed that. "And Victor," she said. "Did you expect him to move this fast?" "No," Michael said. "That I did not expect." The honesty of it hit her differently than she anticipated. She had expected him to be unflappable, to have anticipated every contingency, to be operating from a plan that she simply didn't have full visibility into. The admission that he hadn't seen this coming, that she was not the only one who had been surprised by the shape events had taken, it made her feel paradoxically both more afraid and more steady. More afraid because the man who was supposed to be the most prepared person in the room had been surprised. More steady because he had told her the truth about it. "What do we do?" she said. "Tonight you finish your service," he said. "You go home. You do not deviate from your routine. Victor is testing whether I will move to protect you quickly or whether I'll wait to see how things develop. The answer I want to give him is that moving against anyone connected to me is not a calculation that works out in his favor." He paused. "But I want that answer to be real, not performed. And making it real takes 24 hours. Third time, she'd been asked to give him 24 hours. She thought about that briefly, the pattern of it, the rhythm of trust being built in increments of a day, and found she didn't resent it. 24 hours was a specific, manageable thing. 24 hours was something she knew how to survive. "All right," she said. She put her phone away and walked back to her section and smiled at a couple who had been waiting for her attention and asked if they'd like to hear about the evening's specials. They did. She told them. "The branzino was excellent tonight," she said. Chef Bellini had adjusted the preparation. It was not to be missed. Marco through the kitchen window caught her saying it. He looked at her. His mouth did something that was not quite a smile, too complicated for a smile containing too much, but was in the direction of one. She went on working. The service ran 2 more hours. She closed out her section. She talked to Rosa, who had more questions than Emily had answers for, and she told her honestly that things were changing and that she would explain more when she knew more, and Rosa, who was fundamentally a pragmatic person, accepted that with more grace than Emily expected. She talked to Marco before she left. She found him in the kitchen alone, his breakdown almost finished. She told him that his position was protected. She used that exact word, protected, and she watched what it did to his face, which was the specific undoing of someone who had been holding themselves together through the sustained effort of a person who was not sure they were going to be okay, and who had just been told they were going to be okay, and who was now trying to absorb that information through the armor they'd built against the alternative. He cleared his throat. He looked at his station. "Who told you that?" he said. "Someone with the authority to make it true," she said. He nodded. He did not ask more than that. He reached out and briefly carefully gripped her forearm, not a hug, not a formal handshake. Something in between the specific gesture of a man communicating something he didn't have language for, and then he let go and went back to his breakdown. She left the restaurant at 11:22. She stood on the sidewalk. She thought about Victor Hale, whose name she hadn't known 3 hours ago, and now carried in her mind with the specific weight of something that required attention. She thought about Anthony in the restaurant with 2 men and his coat over his arm. She thought about the phone call at 6 a.m., and the documentation and the board that had preferred not to look until someone made them. She thought about how none of this had been the plan. The plan had been to write a note and protect a stranger and survive the night. The plan had been 4 sentences and shaking hands and 4 minutes at the service station and then going home on the subway and going to sleep. The plan had not included any of what was actually happening. She pulled her coat tighter. She walked toward the subway. Somewhere in the city, in an office she didn't know. In a building she couldn't have named. Behind a name she'd learned an hour ago, a man named Victor Hale knew who she was, knew what she'd done, was deciding what to do about it. She walked down the subway steps and felt the warm tunnel air and heard the distant rumble of an approaching train and thought, 3 nights ago I wrote 4 sentences because an ordinary person was being treated badly by someone who believed he was untouchable. Nothing about what has happened since then has been ordinary. But the 4 sentences still made sense. Whatever Victor Hale decided, the 4 sentences still made sense. The train came. She got on. She slept 4 hours and woke at 5:43 with Victor Hale's name sitting in her mind, like something left on a stove, not burning yet, but warm enough to notice. She lay still for a few minutes and ran through what she actually knew, which was not much. A name. A description of motivation, leverage, pressure, acquisition. The fact that Anthony had called him within hours of being terminated, which meant the relationship between them was not casual, was not the kind of connection you remembered slowly. You called Victor Hale the way you called someone you'd had a standing arrangement with. Someone whose number you kept somewhere accessible because you had always understood that one day you might need it badly and quickly. She got up. She made coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and drank it while the city assembled itself into another day below her, the sounds of it layering up gradually: delivery trucks, a dog, Someone's radio, one floor down, playing something with a lot of bass, the specific percussion of New York morning constructing itself out of 1,000 ordinary sounds. Danny appeared from his room at 6:15, hair disordered, wearing a sweatshirt from his university, with the collar stretched out. He went for the coffee. He looked at her over the rim of his mug, with their mother's eyes, the same directness, the same quality of seeing through the surface of things, and said, "You didn't sleep." "I slept some," she said. "You've got that look," he said. "What look?" "The look where you're already 3 steps into something and you're deciding whether to tell me about it." He drank his coffee. "You said last night you'd tell me what happened." She had said that. She had come home and found him still awake and told him, "Sit down. I have something to tell you." And had then discovered that she didn't know where to start and had said, "Tomorrow, give me until tomorrow." And he had in the way. He'd always done. The way both of them had learned to give each other room when the room was needed, let her go to bed without pushing. Now it was tomorrow, she told him. Not everything. Not Michael's full name. Not the specifics of what Michael was. Not the name Victor Hale, because Danny was 19 and loved her and would spend the rest of the day afraid if she gave him the whole picture. She told him the shape of it, a bad manager, a note, a stranger who turned out to be someone important, a job offer she had accepted. She told him the salary. Danny put down his coffee mug. He picked it up again. He looked at her. He said, "Emily, the bills." "I know," she said. "Mom's next round of therapy." "I know," she said again. "It's covered. Everything's covered." He was 20, and trying not to cry, and managing it by looking very hard at a fixed point on the kitchen wall. She had seen him do this since he was 7 years old, the stubborn refusal to let the feeling take over, the same fight she had in herself, learned from the same source. "You wrote a note," he said finally. "For a stranger." "Yes," she said. "And that changed everything." "It's still changing," she said. "But yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Mom always said you were the brave one," he said. "Mom says things like that," Emily said. "She's usually right," Danny said. He picked up his coffee again and looked into it. "Be careful," he said. Very quiet. The way he said things when they cost him something to say. "I'm being careful," she said. She believed that when she said it. She was at the blue door at 8:58. Michael was there. He had company this morning, not at his table, but in the room. A man she hadn't seen before sat 2 tables away with a newspaper. He wasn't reading, and near the door, a woman in her 40s was having coffee alone, and both of them had that quality of productive stillness that Emily was learning to recognize the way you learn to recognize a particular weather pattern. They were Michael's people. The room was secured. She understood sitting down across from him that this was new. Yesterday and the morning before he had been alone. Today he wasn't. Victor Hale was why the room was secured. Michael looked at her. He read whatever was in her face. "You slept," he said. "Some," she said. Same answer as yesterday. She was developing a pattern with this man that felt like shorthand, the compression of language that happened between people who had been through enough together that full sentences became redundant. "Victor made a move last night," Michael said. No preamble, no warm-up. Her hands found the coffee cup. "What kind of move?" "He had someone contact Marco Bellini," Michael said, "at 10:45 last night, after your service ended." The coffee cup became very important to her hands. She held it steadily. "What kind of contact?" "A man Marco didn't know approached him outside the restaurant," Michael said. "He said he had information about the ownership change at Cassini's. He said that information was going to be relevant to Marco's continued employment. He said that if Marco wanted to understand his situation clearly, he should call a number." "Marco called you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Marco called you?" Michael said. "He didn't have my number. He had yours." She absorbed that. Marco, who had wiped down a clean surface the night before because he needed something to do with his hands. Marco, who had gripped her forearm in the kitchen and couldn't find words. Marco, who had been in this restaurant for 11 years and whose entire existence was organized around the work he did inside it. "He called me at 11:30, she said. I saw the missed call. I was already on the subway. I know, Michael said. My people told me. He also called back at 11:45 and left a message. Emily pulled out her phone. She had it on silent last night and had gone straight to sleep without checking it properly. The specific exhaustion of a person who had been managing their internal state at full capacity for 3 days and had simply run out of processing power for anything additional. There was a voicemail from a number she recognized as Marco's. She played it without earbuds. Michael leaned slightly forward. Marco's voice came out of the phone, low, careful, the voice of a man who was used to being overheard and was choosing his words accordingly, even in a private message. Emily, it's Marco. Something happened tonight after close. A man outside. I don't know him. He said things about the restaurant, about the new ownership, about my job. He gave me a number to call. I didn't call it. A pause. I'm telling you because you told me things would be okay, and I believe you, but I needed someone to know. Call me when you can. Silence. Emily set the phone down. He didn't call the number, she said. No, Michael said. He called you instead. She sat with that for a moment. Marco Bellini, who had followed Anthony's instruction to prepare a bad meal because he was afraid of losing everything. Marco Bellini, who 3 days later had been approached by a stranger offering unclear information about an unclear threat, and who had not called the stranger's number, but had called her instead. Something moved in her chest. She didn't have a clean name for it. It was made of several things at once: responsibility and something that felt like its weight, and underneath the weight, something that was unexpectedly close to its opposite. Victor is using the same playbook as Anthony, she said. He's using a more sophisticated version of it, Michael said. Anthony used fear against people who had no resources. Victor uses it against people who are connected to someone with resources, because the goal isn't to control the person, it's to create a vulnerability that he can use as pressure on me. He paused. The difference is important. Anthony's cruelty was personal. Victor's is strategic. Which is more dangerous, she said. Strategic, Michael said immediately. Personal cruelty is limited by its own emotion. It gets sloppy. It overreaches. Strategic cruelty is patient. He looked at her. Victor has been patient for 18 months. What does he actually want? She said. In concrete terms, not leverage. What's the end goal? Michael looked at her for a moment, assessing something, not her trustworthiness. She thought that question seemed to be settled, but the question of how much detail was useful to give versus how much would add weight without adding clarity. There are 3 properties I control in this city, he said. Commercial properties, well located, well established. Victor has been trying to acquire them for a year and a half through various mechanisms, none of which have succeeded. He believes those properties are underperforming under my management and would generate significantly more revenue under his. He paused. He's right about the revenue. The reason I haven't maximized revenue on those properties is that doing so would require removing the current tenants, several of whom I have long-standing relationships with and have no intention of displacing. She looked at him. So he wants to evict people to make money. In its most basic form, Michael said. Yes. And you won't let him? No. And he's decided that threatening people connected to you is the way to change that. He has decided, Michael said, that if he can create enough pressure points, enough vulnerabilities around me, I will eventually calculate that the cost of holding the properties is higher than the cost of letting them go. He met her eyes. He has not correctly assessed how I make that calculation. Something in the way he said it, precise and entirely without aggression. The statement of a fact, rather than a threat, told her more about Michael DeLuca than anything else he had said in 3 mornings. What do we do about Marco? She said. You call Marco, Michael said, today before noon. You tell him exactly what you know, that the man who approached him last night was connected to someone who is trying to create problems for the restaurant's new ownership, that it has nothing to do with his job security, and that his job is protected unconditionally. He paused. And you tell him that if any similar contact is made, he comes to you first and does not engage. And if it happens again, she said. It won't happen the same way twice, Michael said. Victor is testing responses. He tested Marco and got a response he didn't anticipate. Instead of creating a vulnerability, he created an information flow back to me. He'll adjust. To what? She said. That I don't know yet, Michael said. But I know it won't be Marco again. A silence. The man with the newspaper 2 tables away turned a page. The woman near the door finished her coffee. I want to tell you something, Michael said. She waited. What Victor is doing, using the people around me to apply pressure, it is not new. I have been in situations like this before. I will be in situations like this again. This is the landscape. He looked at her steadily. I want you to understand that you are not obligated to remain inside this landscape. The job offer stands regardless of what Victor does. The salary stands. Your mother's situation stands. But if at any point you decide that the cost of the adjacency to what I deal with is more than you signed on for, I will not hold you to anything. Emily looked at him across the table. She thought about the first morning when she had told him she needed to know what she was choosing before she chose it. She thought about him saying, I protect people who extend me that kind of honesty. She thought about Marco's voicemail and the sound of his voice, low, careful choosing words for an overheard world, and what it meant that he had called her. I'm not leaving, she said. Michael said nothing. I'm not leaving, she said again more quietly. Because Marco called me instead of the number. Because he made a decision about who to trust. And that decision is now something I'm responsible for, whether I wanted the responsibility or not. She paused. You can't give someone a reason to trust you, and then remove yourself when the trust becomes inconvenient. The controlled, still face of Michael DeLuca did something she hadn't seen it do before. A very small, very genuine crack in the surface. Not distress, not weakness, but the specific vulnerability of a man who had not expected to hear exactly that, who had prepared himself for a different answer, and found that the actual answer had landed somewhere deeper than the prepared response could reach. He picked up his coffee. He set it down. All right, he said. She called Marco from outside the coffee shop at 9:41. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. Emily, he said. I got your message, she said. Are you okay? I'm okay, he said. A little rattled. I didn't sleep great. I know, she said. I'm sorry that happened. I want to tell you what it was. She told him not Victor's name, not the full context, but enough. Someone trying to create pressure on the new ownership. Nothing to do with his position. His job was protected. If any contact like that happened again, he called her no hesitation, nothing else. Marco was quiet for a moment after she finished. This is the world you're in now, he said. Not an accusation, not even a question exactly. The statement of someone working something out. Yes, she said honestly. Some version of it. And you're staying in it, he said. Yes, she said. Another silence. You know what's funny, Marco said. Not funny as in amusing. Funny as in the word people used when they'd noticed something true that they didn't have a better word for. 3 days ago, I made a bad meal for a man because Anthony told me to, and I hated it. I hated it the whole time I was doing it, but I did it. A pause. And then you put a note under his plate. And now everything is different. He paused again. I've been in kitchens my whole adult life. I know what it costs to waste good food. But it turns out wasting yourself is worse. Emily stood on the sidewalk and felt the morning cold on her face, and held the phone against her ear, and did not say anything for a moment, because what Marco had just said required the space of a moment. Yeah, she said finally. It is. She was at Cassini's by 11. Not for a shift, the dinner service didn't start until 5, but because the conversation with Michael that morning had ended with him saying that she should begin familiarizing herself with the administrative side of the restaurant as quickly as possible, and because beginning felt better than waiting, and because sitting in her apartment with Victor Hale's name in her mind felt worse than being in motion. She went through Anthony's office for the first time as someone who had the right to be there. It was a strange experience. The space was organized with the precision of a man who had understood that controlling his environment was a proxy for controlling everything else. Files in labeled folders, schedules printed and annotated, a whiteboard with the week's covers broken down by section, all of it immaculate, all of it arranged in the system of a person who had used order as a weapon. She sat at the desk and began reading. What she found over the next 2 hours was worse than she'd fully understood from the outside. The personnel files were the hardest part. Anthony had kept detailed records, not the official HR kind, but his own handwritten notes in a cramped, precise script that documented every leverage point he had identified in every employee. Rodrigo's undocumented cousin, Claire's student loan default, Hassan's wife's visa situation. Things that should never have been in writing. Things that had been written precisely because writing them was a way of holding them, of keeping them close and usable. She found her own file. She sat with it in her hands for a moment before she opened it. Her mother's illness, Danny's partial scholarship, and the gap it left. The overtime hours she had worked in the year Patricia had her stroke the double shifts, the pattern that documented clearly that Emily Carter could not afford to lose this job. He had known all of it. He had always known all of it. And he had used knowing it the way he used everything, not noisily, not overtly, but as a quiet background pressure that shaped every interaction, every instruction, every moment of managed compliance. She felt something that moved through the registers of several emotions before settling in something she recognized as cold clarity. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too short-lived for what she needed right now. Cold clarity. The kind that helped you see shapes. She pulled out the employee files, all of them, and stacked them on the desk. She was going to read every one. She was going to understand what had been used against each person who worked in this restaurant. She was going to take Anthony's inventory of their vulnerabilities and use it for the opposite of what he had used it for. She was still working through the files at 2:30 when Rosa arrived early for prep and found her in the office. Rosa stood in the doorway and looked at the stacked files and looked at Emily and said nothing for a full 5 seconds, which was unusual for Rosa. "You're in Anthony's chair," Rosa said finally. "Yes," Emily said. Rosa looked at the files. "Are those what I think they are?" "Yes," Emily said. Rosa pressed her lips together. She came in and sat down in the chair across the desk. The chair that employees had sat in when Anthony called them in. The chair that had been for 9 years. The specific geography of being in trouble. "How bad is it?" she said. "Bad," Emily said. "But it's over. He's gone. These files," she touched the stack, "are going to be destroyed by the end of the week. Every piece of personal information Anthony documented without consent is going in the shredder." Rosa looked at her for a long moment. "Who made you manager?" she said. Not hostile, genuine. "The owner," Emily said. "Who is the owner?" Rosa said. And she said it with the careful, specific quality of someone who had thought this question through and had decided they needed the answer before they could figure out how to feel about everything else. Emily held her gaze. "Someone who cares that this restaurant runs right," she said. "That's the honest answer I can give you. The rest is complicated." Rosa sat with that. She was not a simple person. Rosa had come to Cassini's after 15 years in kitchens and bars across the city, and she had survived those 15 years through a combination of skill and the ability to assess situations accurately and quickly. She was assessing now. "The 2 guys last night," Rosa said. "At the bar in the high top, the 2 nights before that." "Connected to the owner, yes," Emily said. "And tonight?" "I don't know what tonight looks like yet," Emily said honestly. Rosa nodded slowly. "You're going to tell the staff," she said. "About Anthony. About you. Before service." It wasn't a request. It was Rosa identifying what needed to happen and naming it plainly the way competent people identified operational necessities. "Yes," Emily said. "Before service." "Jake's going to have questions," Rosa said. "He's 19 and he's going to want to know everything, and you're going to have to manage that." "I know," Emily said. "And Dimitri," she said, naming the other line cook. Dimitri's been at this restaurant almost as long as Marco. He's going to be skeptical. I know that too, Emily said. Rosa looked at her steadily. Are you ready for it? Emily thought about the question honestly. She thought about 6 years of reading rooms and adjusting and giving people what they needed before they knew they needed it. She thought about 4 sentences written with shaking hands. She thought about Marco's voicemail and Victor Hale's name and her mother's dream about a garden. I think so, she said. I've been getting ready for it for 6 years without knowing that's what I was doing. Rosa made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in its direction. Okay, she said. She stood up. I'll tell the early arrivals to stay after setup. You can talk to everyone at 4:30. She walked to the door and stopped. Emily, she said. Yeah, what you did, Rosa said. The note. I heard about it from Marco this morning. What you did for that man who turned out to be... She stopped herself. What you did when you didn't know who he was. She paused. I've been in this industry a long time. I've never once seen anyone do anything like that. Emily looked at her. I just wanted to say that, Rosa said. She went out. Emily sat alone in Anthony's office for a few minutes and let that settle. At 4:30, she stood in front of the assembled Cassini staff. 17 full-time employees, 6 of the part-timers who happened to be on tonight, and she told them what she could tell them. Anthony was gone. The restaurant had undergone an ownership change. She was the new general manager, effective immediately. The conditions she had established with the owner, nobody terminated in the first 60 days without her direct approval. No employee held accountable for anything that had happened under the previous management. She stated them plainly. She told them about the files. She watched what that did to the room, the collective release of something, a slow exhalation of breath that wasn't just one person's breath, but everyone's. The specific relief of people who had carried the knowledge that their private vulnerabilities were documented and leveraged, and who were now being told that the documentation was going to be destroyed. It moved through the room like weather. Jake, as Rosa had predicted, had questions. He asked them in the rapid, slightly breathless way of a 19-year-old who needed to understand every moving part of a situation before he could feel okay about it. Emily answered what she could and told him honestly, when she didn't know which seemed to satisfy him more than a complete answer would have the honesty of the gaps. She was learning was sometimes more reassuring than the substance of what you knew. Dimitri, the line cook, did not ask questions. He sat with his arms crossed and his face closed and listened, and when she had finished, he looked at her for a long moment and then looked at Marco, who was beside him. Marco met his eyes and gave one small nod. Dimitri's arms came uncrossed. He looked back at Emily and said, "Okay." Just that. But from Dimitri, she understood from the room's response that was enough. Service began. It was a good service. Not perfect. The transition energy was in the room, the way any significant change left a texture in the air that the work had to move through rather than around. But it was good. The tables turned cleanly. Marco's kitchen ran with the precision she had come to expect from it, and something more, a steadiness, a confidence in the cooking, as though the food itself was different when the person making it wasn't afraid. At 7:21, the man came in. She noticed him, the way she had learned to notice things peripherally, quickly cataloging details before she could identify why the details mattered. He was somewhere in his early 50s. He wore a coat that was expensive in the same understated way that Michael's had been the first-night quality that didn't announce itself. He sat at the bar. He ordered sparkling water. He did not look at his phone. He looked at the room. More specifically, he looked at Emily. Not the way customers looked at servers with the ambient, unfocused attention of someone monitoring for service. He looked at her with a specific targeted quality that told her this was not a man who had come in for dinner. He was looking at her the way the men in Anthony's office had looked at Anthony, with the focused patience of someone conducting an assessment. Her phone was in her apron pocket. She kept working. She had a table of 4 who were deciding between 2 desserts, and she helped them decide, and she refilled waters, and she brought a check, and she did all of it while tracking the man at the bar with the same peripheral precision she had used 3 nights ago to track Michael DeLuca at table 7. She did not call Michael, not yet. She moved behind the bar on the pretext of retrieving a bottle Rosa had asked for. She came within 6 feet of the man. He turned his head and looked at her directly. "Emily Carter," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, a statement. She looked at him. "My name is Victor Hale," he said, very quietly, very pleasantly. The way people said things when they wanted to communicate that they didn't need volume to make an impression. "I thought it was time we met." The bar, the sparkling water, the coat that didn't announce itself, the eyes that had the quality of total patient attention, and the name she had been carrying for 24 hours, like a weight she couldn't put down coming out of his mouth in this room in her restaurant, attached to a face that was now in front of her. She had told herself riding the subway last night that the 4 sentences still made sense. She had told herself that whatever Victor Hale decided to do, the note still made sense. She stood in front of him now. She thought about Michael saying, if he makes contact, you don't engage, you just call. She thought about what it meant to call. The man at the bar 2 tables away, the woman near the door. Michael's people already here, already seeing this, already watching. She held Victor Hale's gaze. "Mr. Hale," she said with the steady, neutral composure of someone who had spent 6 years managing difficult situations in restaurant environments. "I'm afraid we're quite busy tonight. Is there something I can help you with?" His eyes moved over her face, assessing, looking for the crack, the flinch, the give. He didn't find it. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not retreat. Too early for that. But an adjustment, the micro-recalibration of a man who had expected a different response and was now processing the implications of not getting it. "I think there are things we could help each other with," he said, "if you're willing to have a real conversation." "I'm working," Emily said. "This isn't a good time." "It's rarely a good time for these conversations," Victor said pleasantly. "That's why I prefer to find people in their element. It's more honest." "I appreciate that," Emily said with the same neutrality. "If you'd like to make an appointment through the restaurant's management office, I'm happy to find some time this week." She walked away from the bar. She did not hurry. She walked at the same pace she always walked. The measured efficiency of someone moving between tasks, and she went to the service station and turned her back to the bar and reached into her apron pocket and sent Michael a single text. "He's here. Bar. Victor Hale." He introduced himself. The response came in 40 seconds. "Don't leave the floor. Keep working. Do not engage further. I'm on my way." She put the phone back in her pocket. She went to check on the table of 4. She refilled their waters. She brought a second round of coffee. She smiled, and meant it, not because the situation called for performance, but because the table of 4 was a couple celebrating their anniversary, and their adult daughter, who had brought her husband for the first time to meet her parents, and their happiness was real and self-contained, and had nothing to do with what was happening at the bar, and deserved her full attention. She gave it to them. Victor Hale sat at the bar for 21 minutes. He drank his sparkling water. He did not leave. He did not approach her again. He simply sat and watched the room with the patient, unhurried quality of a man who was comfortable and in no hurry, and wanted the people he was watching to understand that. Michael came through the front door at 7:54. He did not look at Emily. He came in with one of the men she recognized from previous evenings, and they went directly to the bar, and Michael sat down 2 seats from Victor Hale, with the specific, deliberate choice of proximity that communicated everything without a word. Victor looked at Michael. Michael looked at Victor. Neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted long enough for Emily across the room to feel it as a physical thing. The weight of 2 men in the same space, each fully aware of the other, each measuring something that she didn't have complete access to. Then Victor said something. She couldn't hear it from her distance. Michael said something back. Victor's expression remained pleasant. Michael's remained controlled. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. She counted because she was watching while pretending not to watch the skill she had developed over 6 years, and was apparently going to need to develop further. At the end of 4 minutes, Victor Hale stood up. He adjusted his coat. He looked once across the room directly at Emily, and the look carried something she felt but couldn't entirely name. Not a threat, not a concession. Something that sat between acknowledgement and appraisal, as though he was filing her away under a different category than the one he had arrived with. He left. Michael sat at the bar for another minute. Then he came to find her. He did it smoothly, the way people moved through restaurant spaces when they didn't want to create the impression of urgency, unhurried, as though he simply happened to be moving in her direction. He stopped near her at the service station. "You didn't call," he said quietly. "I texted," she said. "I meant when he first came in," he said, before he identified himself. "I wasn't sure it was him yet," she said, "and I didn't want to call and be wrong and put you in motion for nothing." He looked at her. "You handled him," he said. "I redirected him," she said. "There's a difference." "Not from where I was standing," Michael said. She held his gaze. "What did you say to him just now?" "I told him," Michael said, "that the approach he took tonight coming into my property and making contact with a member of my staff without my knowledge was not something that would happen a second time without consequences." "And what did he say?" "He said he was simply having a drink in a fine restaurant and expressing admiration for the new management," Michael said. "And he smiled when he said it, because Victor Hale is not a man who is easily rattled, and he wanted me to understand that." "Is he rattled?" she said. Michael was quiet for a moment. "He came here himself," he said. "He sent someone to Marco and handled that at a distance, which is his preference. Coming here himself means something has changed in his calculation." He paused. "You changed it." "Me," she said flatly. "He expected someone I would need to protect," Michael said. "Someone who would need to be moved, managed, kept away from him. He came here tonight to confirm that assessment, to see for himself how much leverage you represented." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't behave like someone who needed protecting." Emily thought about standing at the bar with Victor Hale's name coming out of his mouth, and her own name coming out of his mouth, and the deliberate, patient quality of his attention, and the thing she had felt in response to all of that, which had not been as simple as courage, which had been more like the specific state you arrived at when you had already faced the most frightening version of something, and everything subsequent was measurable against that baseline. The note, 4 sentences, shaking hands, everything since then measured against that. "What happens next with him?" she said. "He recalibrates," Michael said. "He tries something I haven't anticipated yet. That is always what happens next with Victor." He paused. "But tonight he left, and that matters." She nodded. He turned to go. He had almost cleared her section when she said Michael. He stopped. "The employees," she said. "I told them tonight about the ownership change, the manager position, the files, all of it." She paused. "I destroyed Anthony's leverage files on everyone. All of them." He turned back. He looked at her. "All of them," she said, "including the one on me." He said nothing for a moment. "That was mine to do," she said. "My people, my call." Another moment. "Yes," he said quietly. "It was." He went. She finished service. She closed out her section. She talked to the staff as they broke down real conversations, the kind that didn't happen when a particular kind of pressure was in the room, the kind she was beginning to understand were part of what a restaurant could be when someone wasn't using fear as infrastructure. Jake told her about his sister in Boston. Dmitri told Marco something in Russian, and they both laughed, which she had never heard them do in 6 years of working near each other. Rosa found her at the coat check. "He came in tonight," she said. "The man Anthony was scared of." "Yes," Emily said. Rosa looked at her carefully. And he left," Emily said. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're really doing this?" "Yes," Emily said. "You're really staying in it?" "Yes." Rosa shook her head slowly, not in disbelief, in the way people shook their heads when something they had not expected turned out to be real. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She got her coat. She paused at the door. For what it's worth, I'm glad you wrote the note. She left. Emily stood alone in the quiet restaurant. The room was clean, and reset tablecloths freshed the particular stillness of a space prepared and waiting full of potential that wasn't yet inhabited. She had run the room tonight. Not perfectly. She was the first to catalog every moment she had misread, every adjustment she had made. A half-second late every question from staff she had answered less cleanly than she wanted to. She was running a steep learning curve on a very short timeline, inside a situation that had dimensions she still couldn't fully see. But she had run it. She got her coat. She turned off the lights section by section, the way she had watched Anthony do it for 6 years, the methodical work of closing a space down for the night with care. She did it the way she did everything with attention, with the understanding that the quality of this small act was not separate from the quality of everything else. She locked the front door. She stood outside on the sidewalk and looked at the dark city. Somewhere in it, Victor Hale was recalibrating. Somewhere in it, Michael DeLuca was working on something she didn't have full visibility into. Somewhere in it, Anthony Russo was sitting with the weight of what he'd lost, and the phone calls that hadn't gone the way he'd needed them to. And here outside this restaurant that now had her name attached to its direction, Emily Carter stood in her coat in the February cold and understood something she hadn't fully understood until tonight. She had written the note to protect a stranger. She was still protecting people. The stranger had just turned out to be a much larger and more complicated version of what she'd originally reached for. And the people she was protecting now included the entire staff of a restaurant, and Marco, who had called her instead of a stranger's number, and her mother, whose bills were going to be paid, and Danny, whose scholarship was going to hold. 4 sentences. Do not eat this meal. You are being targeted. Trust me. She walked toward the subway, and the city carried her home. She had been general manager of Cassini's for 11 days when Victor Hale made his next move. She had not expected 11 days. She had expected, based on everything Michael had told her, based on the quality of Victor's patience and the strategic precision of how he operated, she had expected something sooner. The first 3 days after his appearance at the bar, she had gone to work in a state of low-grade alertness, the specific readiness of someone who knows something is coming and cannot determine from which direction. By day 5, the alertness had not reduced, but had integrated itself into the ordinary rhythm of her work, the way a sound you can't identify eventually becomes part of the background rather than a disruption of it. By day 11, she had almost stopped waiting. Almost. She was at her desk at 9:45 in the morning, working through the week's scheduling the specific granular arithmetic of restaurant staffing, matching availability against covers, against section assignments. The puzzle that Anthony had always handled with the private proprietary air of someone who understood that controlling information was a form of power when Rosa knocked on the open office door and said, "There's a man asking for you, front of house. He says he's from the city." Emily looked up. "From the city," she said. "Department of Health," Rosa said. "He has a badge." Emily set down her pen. She had learned in 11 days to read Rosa's face with a new precision, to distinguish between the expressions Rosa produced for ordinary problems and the expressions she produced for things that didn't fit ordinary categories. This was the second kind. "Send him in," Emily said, "and tell Marco I'll be 5 minutes late for the morning walkthrough." The man from the Department of Health was named Gerald Fitch, and he was in his late 50s with the specific practiced neutrality of a city inspector. A man whose job required him to produce the same expression across an enormous range of situations to be equally unreadable, whether he was looking at a pristine kitchen or a catastrophe, because the expression itself was part of the mechanism. He wore a city-issued lanyard. He had a clipboard. He sat across from Emily in the chair that Rosa had once described as the chair of being in trouble, and he explained that Cassini's had been flagged for an unscheduled inspection based on a complaint filed with the department. "What kind of complaint?" Emily said. "Food safety," he said. "Specifically an allegation of improper food storage and preparation practices." He paused. "The complaint was filed 6 days ago. 6 days ago." 5 days after Victor Hale had sat at her bar and ordered sparkling water and introduced himself by name and looked across the room at her with the specific quality of a man filing something away. "I see," Emily said. "When would you like to conduct the inspection?" "Now," he said. Emily looked at him for a moment. Gerald Fitch looked back with the practiced neutrality of his profession. She could not read from his face whether he knew what this inspection was, whether he understood that it had been generated not by any actual food safety concern, but by someone with resources and patience who had found a different category of leverage to try. She stood up. "Of course," she said. "I'll walk you through myself." She texted Michael while walking Gerald Fitch to the kitchen DOH inspection. "Unscheduled. Complaint filed 6 days ago. I know what this is." His response came in 40 seconds, the same response time as always. "I know. Don't stop it. Let him inspect everything. Call me when he's done." She put the phone in her pocket and opened the kitchen door and said, "Marco, we have a Department of Health inspector. Full access starting now." Marco looked at her. His face did the thing she had come to recognize, the rapid internal processing of a man who understood more than he was going to say in a room where other people were present. He nodded. "Of course," he said to Gerald Fitch. "Where would you like to start?" Emily walked the inspection with them. Every refrigeration unit, every storage area, every surface, every temperature log, every food safety protocol that Marco and his kitchen ran with a precision that had been, she was understanding more fully each day, the expression of a man's genuine love for what he did. Marco Bellini ran a clean kitchen, not because anyone made him. He ran a clean kitchen because cooking well and handling food carelessly were to him contradictions so fundamental they couldn't coexist. The inspection took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Gerald Fitch found nothing. She watched him look for it. The systematic, thorough search of a man doing his job correctly, checking every place a legitimate complaint might originate. She watched him find in place after place the exact opposite of what the complaint had alleged. She watched his neutrality develop a quality she couldn't name precisely but would have described if pressed as embarrassment, the professional discomfort of someone who had arrived expecting one thing and found another, and was aware that the gap between the two was not accidental. At the end, he sat back down in the office across from her, and he signed the inspection report, and he pushed it across the desk. She read it. Clean on every category. No violations. No required follow-up. "The complaint appears to have been inaccurate," he said carefully. "It appears so," Emily said. He gathered his clipboard. He stood up. He was almost at the door when he stopped, and she recognized the quality of the stop, a man deciding whether to say something he had not planned to say. "Miss Carter," he said without turning around fully. "In 22 years of doing this job, complaints that produce inspection results like this one." He paused. "They have a particular origin usually." She held still. He turned enough to look at her briefly. "I'd recommend documenting today very carefully," he said. "Date-time inspection result. Keep a copy somewhere outside the restaurant." He left. Emily sat alone in the office for a moment. She thought about what he had just done, the small specific risk of a city inspector stepping outside his professional neutrality to tell a woman he didn't know that she should protect herself, the particular courage of small specific risks. She was becoming familiar with that category. She called Michael. "He found nothing," she said. "I know," Michael said. "I've already seen the report." She absorbed that. "How?" "It's a city department," he said. "I have contacts." Of course he did. She was still calibrating the extent of his reach, still coming across the edges of it in unexpected places, the way you discovered the full size of something by walking its perimeter. "Victor filed the complaint 6 days ago," she said. "Yes," Michael said. "He waited 5 days after coming to the restaurant," she said. "He watched to see if you would move to protect me immediately or if you would wait. When he saw you weren't moving restaurants or changing how I operated, he concluded that a disruption to the restaurant's operations might be more effective than direct pressure on me personally." A brief silence. "That's exactly right," Michael said. And when the inspection found nothing, he recalibrates again, Michael said. How many times does he recalibrate before he stops? She said. That, Michael said, is what I need to talk to you about. Can you come to me at noon? Not the coffee shop. I'll text you an address. The address was a building she didn't recognize on a street she had walked past many times without knowing what was inside it. She arrived at 11:58. A man she recognized from previous evenings held the door and brought her up in an elevator that opened directly into a space that was clearly an office, but felt nothing like one. Books on every wall. A desk that had the specific inhabited quality of something used daily for a very long time. 2 chairs near a window looking out over a city that was doing what it always did. Massive and indifferent and beautiful. Michael was at the desk. He stood when she came in, which was new. He had never stood for her before, had never offered that formality. And the fact that he did now registered as information she couldn't fully categorize yet. A man she had never seen before was sitting in one of the chairs near the window. He was in his 60s. White-haired, lean, wearing a suit that occupied the register above Michael's, not because it was more expensive, but because it had the specific authority of clothes worn for decades by someone who had never needed them to announce anything. He looked at her with the calm, comprehensive attention of someone who assessed people as a professional practice. Emily, Michael said, this is Thomas Aldrich. The name landed differently than Victor Hale's name had landed 6 days ago. Victor's name had carried threat. Thomas Aldrich's name carried something older and heavier, the specific gravity of a name that had been in certain rooms for a very long time. Mr. Aldrich, she said. Miss Carter, he said. His voice was the kind of voice that had made decisions in quiet rooms for 40 years. Sit down, please. She sat. Michael sat at the desk. Thomas Aldrich remained in his chair with the total stillness of a man for whom stillness was not an effort. I'm going to be direct with you, Aldrich said, because Michael tells me you prefer it. I do, she said. Victor Hale is not going to stop, Aldrich said. The inspection this morning is the 3rd move he's made in 11 days. The contact with your chef. The visit to the restaurant now, the DOH complaint. Each one has been calibrated to test a different kind of response. The inspection was testing whether a bureaucratic disruption would affect the restaurant's operations, and whether you would attempt to intervene in the process or simply allow it to proceed. I allowed it to proceed, she said. Yes, Aldrich said. Which told him something about you that the previous 2 tests had not. He paused. It told him you were not acting on instinct or emotion. It told him you were capable of strategic patience. Emily looked at him steadily. Is that good or bad for our situation? It's good, Aldrich said. And it is precisely why I'm in this room today. He glanced at Michael briefly, then back at her. Victor's campaign against Michael's properties is not fundamentally about the properties. It is about a position Victor wants in a negotiation that is occurring at a level above what you've been told about. She looked at Michael. Michael was looking at her with the specific expression she had learned to read as him communicating more than he was saying. There is a larger conversation happening between Victor and me, he said carefully. A conversation about territory. Influence. The kind of conversation that takes a very long time and has many layers. He paused. Victor believes that if he can create enough friction around me, enough disruption to what I protect, I will come to that conversation in a weakened position. And the restaurant, Emily said slowly, and Marco, and the DOH inspection, those are all part of creating that friction. Yes, Michael said. So I'm not the target, she said. I'm the instrument. You were intended to be, Aldrich said. The intention was that your presence in Michael's circle would represent a vulnerability, someone without experience in this landscape, someone who could be pressured or frightened or compromised into providing Victor with leverage. He paused. That intention has not produced the expected result. She thought about Gerald Fitch's professional neutrality and the way it had acquired the quality she'd labeled embarrassment. She thought about Victor's face in the restaurant when she had redirected him without flinching. She thought about Marco calling her instead of the number. "What happens now?" she said. Aldrich looked at Michael. Michael looked at her. "There is a meeting," Michael said, "between me and Victor, in 3 days. This meeting has been arranged through channels that are—" He searched for a word: established, formal. The kind of meeting that occurs when two people have reached the point in a conflict where continuing to exchange moves is less productive than sitting in the same room. He paused. Victor has agreed to it, which means he believes he is coming to that meeting with leverage. "Does he have leverage?" she said. "He believes he has you," Michael said. "He believes that the pressure campaign of the past 11 days has created a situation where I feel the need to protect someone who is not experienced enough to protect herself, and that the cost of that protection is a concession in his direction." The room was very quiet. Emily sat with what she had just heard. She sat with the full weight of it, the specific weight of understanding that you have been assessed, measured, categorized, and found useful in a way that has nothing to do with who you actually are. Victor Hale had looked at her and seen a liability, a pressure point. 4 sentences written with shaking hands translated by a man who had never met her into a vulnerability to be exploited. She felt something move through her that was not anger and not fear, but something adjacent to both the specific heat of a person who has been underestimated in a way that is both insulting and clarifying. "He's wrong," she said. "Yes," Michael said. "He is." "Then show him," she said. Both men looked at her. "The meeting," she said. "In 3 days. I want to be there." Silence. Aldrich shifted in his chair. Michael's face did nothing visible, but she had become good enough at reading his nothing visible to know that something had moved behind it. "That's not a standard request," Aldrich said carefully. "I understand that," Emily said. "But if Victor's entire calculation is based on the assumption that I'm a liability, that I'm someone Michael needs to spend resources protecting, then the most direct way to correct that calculation is for Victor to sit across a table from me and understand the assumption was wrong." She paused. "Not because anyone tells him it was wrong, because he sees it for himself." Thomas Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Michael. Michael was looking at her with the expression she had first seen across a small coffee shop table 9 days ago, the look of a man encountering something he had not anticipated and was now processing in real time. "It's not safe," Michael said. Quietly. Not a dismissal. A fact. "I know," she said. "I'm not saying it's safe. I'm saying it's right." She met his eyes. "You told me the first morning that real courage wasn't the absence of fear. You told me that doing the right thing while being afraid was what mattered." She paused. "I'm afraid. I want to be in that room anyway." A long silence. Aldrich cleared his throat. "Michael," he said. "I heard her," Michael said. Another silence. Then, "If you're in that room," Michael said, "you don't speak unless I ask you to. You don't react to anything Victor says about you regardless of what it is. You sit, and you hold that composure of yours that has apparently been confusing everyone for the past 11 days. He held her gaze. "Can you do that?" "Yes," she said. "It's going to be designed to unsettle you," he said. "Victor is going to say things specifically intended to produce a reaction. He's going to make it about the note, about you being naive, about the fact that you walked into a situation you didn't understand." He paused. "He's going to try to make you feel small." Emily thought about Anthony Russo's voice saying 6 years, and I never saw it. She thought about what it had felt like to have the entirety of her vulnerability documented in a file in someone else's office. She thought about her mother's hand, thinner, warmer than expected both hands, the grip that communicated what words didn't reach. "Let him try," she said. Aldrich made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was short and unperformed and surprised, and it aged him down by about 15 years for the second it lasted. "All right," Michael said. 3 days, Thursday. She left the building at 12:47. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and thought about what she had just agreed to. And the thought was not entirely comfortable, but discomfort had become a familiar companion over the past 12 days, and she had learned to distinguish between the kind that meant danger and the kind that meant growth, and to treat them accordingly. She went back to the restaurant. She ran the lunch service. She did the afternoon walkthrough with Marco that she had postponed for the inspection. She sat with Rosa at 3 and went through the week's numbers covers revenue per table turn time with the focused attention of someone learning a new language and determined to become fluent. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers because when you had no margin for error with money, you became good with numbers the way you became good with anything that survival required. At 4:30, she called Danny. He answered immediately. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need you to answer honestly, not protectively. Okay, he said. Careful now. If you knew I was going to do something that mattered and it carried some risk, she said, would you tell me not to do it? A pause. She could hear him thinking. What kind of risk? He said. The kind that's real, she said. Not catastrophic, but real. Another pause. Is this about the job? It's about a meeting, she said. In 3 days. I've asked to be present at something that is above my experience level and involves people who are used to operating in a way I'm still learning. Danny was quiet for a long moment. When you were 15, he said finally. And I was stupid enough to follow Marcus and those guys out to the park, and you found out you didn't tell me not to do things like that. He paused. You asked me why I had done it. And when I told you I had done it because I thought I needed to prove something to people who didn't care about me, you said the only proof that matters is the kind you give yourself. She held the phone against her ear. I've been thinking about that for 4 years, Danny said. Do the meeting, Emily. She called her mother next, and her mother said, You're going to tell me something that's going to make me worry. And Emily said, Probably. And her mother said, Tell me anyway. And she did in broad strokes in the careful, honest language she had developed over the past 12 days for communicating truth without communicating every dimension of risk. And when she finished, her mother was quiet and then said, Are you going because you're afraid? Or are you going because it's right? Both, Emily said. Then go, her mother said. The 3 days passed with the specific loaded quality of time when you know something significant is at the end of it. She ran the restaurant. She learned the scheduling system and the ordering system and the vendor relationships with the focused speed of someone who understood that competence was the best available form of protection. She had 2 more conversations with Thomas Aldrich, who turned out to be beneath the 60-year-old authority of his presence, a genuinely methodical teacher, someone who explained the architecture of the meeting she was entering with the precision of a person who believed knowledge was the most reliable antidote to fear. She was afraid anyway. She went to sleep Thursday morning at 2 a.m. and was awake at 4:45 and gave up on sleep at 5 and sat in the kitchen with coffee while the city outside assembled its ordinary morning sounds and thought about what it meant to walk into a room that had been designed specifically for her to fail inside. She thought, I have been in rooms designed for me to fail inside my entire adult life. I have been in those rooms with a mother in the hospital and a brother's tuition in my hands, and a job that could be taken from me by a man who documented my vulnerabilities in a private file. I have stood at service stations calculating whether I could afford to do the right thing and finding the math impossible and doing it anyway. This is just a bigger version of that room. Michael called at 7. How are you? He said. Afraid, she said. Same answer as always. Good, he said. Same word as always. But this time there was something else in it, something she identified after a moment as protectiveness. Not the protectiveness of someone who didn't think you could handle it. The protectiveness of someone who didn't want you to have to. I'll be fine, she said. I know, he said. The meeting is at 2. I'll have a car at the restaurant at 1:30. She dressed carefully. She wore the clothes she had worn the day she accepted the manager position, not as superstition, but because she had been competent. That day had been fully herself that day, and she wanted the physical memory of that. She arrived at the restaurant at 9 and worked until 1:15, and then took off her apron and washed her hands and looked at herself in the mirror in the staff bathroom and said quietly to the face looking back at her, You wrote the note. Everything else is just what came after. The car came at 1:30. She got in. The meeting was in a hotel conference room on the east side, the kind of anonymous neutral space that certain kinds of meetings required, places that belonged to no one, and therefore gave neither side the structural advantage of home ground. Thomas Aldrich was already there when they arrived. Two men Emily recognized were positioned near the door in the way she had learned to expect visible but not obtrusive the grammar of Michael's security presence. Victor Hale arrived 4 minutes after they did. He came with two people, a man who was clearly legal counsel of some kind, carrying a leather portfolio, and a woman in her 40s, whom Emily could not categorize, but who had the specific alert quality of someone whose job was to watch and remember. Victor himself looked exactly as he had looked at the bar 11 days ago. Same coat. Same quality of unhurried patience. He looked at Michael when he came in, and then he looked at Emily, and something registered in his expression, a very slight adjustment, a micro-recalibration. The movement of a man who had prepared for a particular configuration of the room and found it different than he'd expected. She was here. He had not anticipated that she would be here. Good, she thought. They sat. Aldrich and Victor's legal counsel managed the formalities, the acknowledgement of what this meeting was, the terms of its confidentiality, the protocol. Emily sat to Michael's left and held the composure Michael had asked her to hold, and watched Victor Hale watch her, while pretending to focus on the legal formalities. Then Victor spoke. He was, she understood, immediately exceptionally good at this. His voice was measured and warm, carrying the specific register of a man who had learned to make his reasonableness sound like generosity. He laid out his position clearly, the properties, the opportunity. He believed they represented the revenue potential that was in his assessment being wasted. He spoke for 11 minutes without raising his voice or making a direct threat, and in those 11 minutes she heard every argument arranged in its most persuasive possible form. And then he paused, and he looked at her. "I think Miss Carter understands," he said with the pleasant, pointed quality of his most particular register, "that she entered this situation in a way that placed her inside a dynamic she wasn't prepared for." He held her gaze. A young woman with a sick mother and a brother in school working a waitress job writing notes to strangers. The pleasant voice didn't change. It's an admirable impulse, but impulse isn't strategy. He was doing exactly what Michael had said he would do, making it about the note, about naivety, about a woman who had stumbled into something beyond her comprehension and was now being used as a prop by someone who understood the landscape, and she didn't. She held his gaze. She said nothing. He watched her for a moment. The pleasantness remained. The patience remained. But something else appeared behind both of them. The faintest edge of uncertainty, the micro-expression of a man who has delivered a line that has always produced a reaction and is processing the absence of one. He moved on. He continued his position. He offered terms. He laid out what he wanted and what he was prepared to give in exchange, and the terms were not unreasonable. That was the craft of them. They were calibrated to sound like generosity while delivering advantage. And Emily sat and listened and held the composure Michael had asked her to hold, and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt calm. Not the performed calm of someone suppressing fear. Actual calm. The specific, grounded stillness of a person who knows exactly who they are and what they are doing here and why, and for whom that knowledge is sufficient, regardless of what the room contains. Victor finished. A silence. Michael looked at Aldrich. Some communication passed between them, the compressed language of people who had worked together for a long time. Then Michael looked at Emily. "Emily," he said. Victor's legal counsel looked up from his portfolio. Victor himself went very still. Emily looked at Michael. He gave her one small nod. She looked at Victor Hale. "Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice came out the way it had come out at the bar 11 days ago. Steady, neutral, with the specific professional composure of someone who had spent 6 years managing difficult situations in restaurant environments, and had spent the past 11 days managing considerably more difficult ones. "You've described what I did 11 days ago as impulse, as naivety, as something a woman in my position couldn't have understood the consequences of. She paused. I want to correct that assessment. Victor looked at her. The pleasantness was still there. The patience was still there. But she could see him recalibrating in real time, and she found that she did not find it frightening. She found it clarifying. I wrote that note, she said, after 4 minutes of deliberation during which I fully understood what it could cost me. I understood that I might lose the job that was keeping my family above water. I understood that I didn't know who the man was or whether protecting him would produce any outcome other than my own termination. She held Victor's gaze without softening it. I wrote it anyway, not because I didn't understand the consequences, because I understood them and decided they were the wrong basis for making the decision. Victor said nothing. You have spent 11 days trying to determine what I'm afraid of, Emily said. You sent someone to Marco to find out if I could be pressured through the people I worked with. You came to the restaurant yourself to find out if I could be unsettled by direct contact. You filed a fraudulent health inspection complaint to find out if a bureaucratic disruption would compromise how I operated. She paused. I want to save you some time. The answer to all 3 questions was the same, and it will continue to be the same. Victor Hale looked at her across the conference table. The pleasant voice said nothing. The patient expression did something very small, a slight shift in the eyes, the adjustment of a man who was fully paying attention. You're not what I expected, he said finally. I know, she said. Michael told you what I was going to say today, he said. He prepared you. He told me you would try to make me feel small, she said. He was right, and the preparation was helpful, but it wasn't necessary. She looked at him steadily. I have been made to feel small by experts. I have survived all of them. The mechanism is familiar. A silence that lasted long enough to have weight. Thomas Aldrich shifted in his chair. Victor's legal counsel was looking at his portfolio with the careful attention of a man who has decided to become invisible. Victor Hale looked at Emily Carter for a long moment, and then something happened that she had not anticipated, and that Michael had not anticipated, and that Thomas Aldrich, who had been in rooms like this for 40 years, would later describe as the most unexpected thing he had witnessed in 2 decades of negotiation. Victor Hale smiled, not the pleasant strategic smile she had seen at the bar. Something different. Something that had more honesty in it than anything else he'd produced in this room, a smaller smile, with the specific quality of a man who has just been genuinely surprised by something, and has decided for reasons of his own to acknowledge it. All right, he said. To Emily, not to Michael, to her. He looked at his legal counsel. Something passed between them. He looked back at Michael. The Carter Street property, he said. I want the Carter Street property. The other 2 are yours. Carter Street was, she would learn later, the property Victor had wanted most of the 18 months, the one with the highest revenue potential, the one whose tenants Michael had been most reluctant to displace. It was a significant concession from Victor's original position. It was also significantly less than he'd come in demanding. Michael looked at Aldrich. A very brief exchange, a decision made in compressed language. We'll need 72 hours, Michael said. You have them, Victor said. He stood. He adjusted his coat. He looked at Emily one final time, and the look had a quality she had not seen from him before. Not warmth exactly, because Victor Hale was not a man whose primary register was warmth, but something that contained acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a man who has been shown something he hadn't believed existed and has decided to update his working model of the world accordingly. He left. The room reorganized itself in his absence, the specific pressure drop of a significant presence departing the gradual return of ordinary breathing. Thomas Aldrich said, Well. Michael was looking at Emily. She looked back at him. You spoke, he said. You nodded, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Where did that come from? She thought about it honestly. She thought about her mother's hands and Danny's stretched sweatshirt and Marco wiping a clean surface. She thought about Rosa saying she'd never seen anyone do anything like that. She thought about Gerald Fitch telling her to document today carefully and keep a copy somewhere outside the restaurant. The same place the note came from, she said. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in March, Emily arrived at Cassini's an hour before the lunch prep and found Marco already in the kitchen earlier than she'd ever seen him doing something she had not seen him do in 11 years at that restaurant. He was developing a new menu, not adjusting existing dishes, not rotating specials. A new menu, entirely new, handwritten on 3 sheets of paper, spread across the prep counter, organized into sections with the specific energy of a man who had been given permission to think at full capacity for the first time in a very long time. He looked up when she came in. "Is this okay?" he said. Careful. The instinct of someone who had learned to check. She looked at the papers. She looked at what was on them. The food she could read in the descriptions, its ambition, its care, the specific love of someone who was finally cooking from the best version of himself, rather than the compressed, managed version that fear produced. "Marco," she said, "it's more than okay." He nodded. He looked back down at his papers. He picked up his pen. That afternoon, Emily sat in the office. Her office now the files shredded and the room reorganized into something that felt like a space for work rather than a space for control. And she looked at the week's numbers and thought about what the restaurant was becoming. The covers were up 18% over the same period the previous year. The staff turnover, which Anthony had maintained at a steady churn as part of his management philosophy, always someone afraid of being replaceable, always someone new enough to be compliant, had flatlined. Rosa had told her last week that Jake had turned down a position at another restaurant to stay. Dmitri had stopped looking over his shoulder before he spoke. Things were changing, not all at once, not without friction. The friction was daily the learning curve of a woman running a complicated operation. For the first time, the adjustments to supplier relationships and vendor contracts and the 1,000 administrative details that Anthony had kept opaque as a power mechanism, and that Emily was systematically demystifying. The friction of rebuilding trust with a staff who had spent years learning that the person in charge of them was someone to be navigated rather than believed. The friction of being inside a world that had dimensions she was still learning to see clearly, but they were changing. At 5:30 on that Tuesday evening, her phone rang. "Michael." She answered. "Everything okay?" "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "The Carter Street property," he said. "The tenants there. There's a family that's been in one of the units for 23 years. A man named Aurelio, who runs a small watch repair shop on the ground floor. He's been there since the building was built in his category." A pause. Victor's acquisition of that property means he has the right to renegotiate their leases. In Victor's standard model, that means displacing them. Emily held very still. "I renegotiated the sale agreement," Michael said, "as part of the 72-hour period. There is now a clause protecting the existing tenants' leases for the duration of their current terms." He paused. Victor accepted the clause. She heard what he was saying. He had used the 72 hours not to give Victor what he'd asked for, but to give Victor what he'd asked for, minus the part that hurt people who hadn't done anything to deserve it. "Why are you telling me?" she said softly. "Because," Michael said, "you would have asked, and I wanted you to know before you asked." A pause. "And because I have been thinking over the past 3 weeks about what you said in that meeting, about the note, about making decisions on the wrong basis." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been making some decisions on a different basis than I used to." She sat in the office that had been Anthony's and felt the weight of what he had just said, the full specific weight of it, and did not try to reduce it to something smaller than it was. "Michael," she said. "Yes." "That note," she said. "I almost didn't write it." "I know," he said. "4 minutes," she said. "I almost chose the other thing." "I know," he said again. And then very quietly, "I'm glad you didn't." She sat with the phone pressed to her ear and the March light coming through the window of the office that was hers now, and thought about all the distances between 4 sentences written with shaking hands, And here all the mornings at the Blue Door, all the closed offices and inspection clipboards, and sparkling water at bars and conversations with men who had spent their lives measuring the world in terms of leverage and advantage. All the distances between the woman at the service station calculating the cost and the woman who had looked at Victor Hale across a conference table and told him clearly and without performance who she was. She thought about her mother saying the right ones always feel scary. She thought about Danny saying, "Do the meeting, Emily." She thought about Marco's new menu spread across the prep counter. She thought about Rosa and Jake, who had turned down another job, and Dimitri, who had stopped looking over his shoulder, and Gerald Fitch, who had told her to document carefully and keep a copy somewhere outside the restaurant, and Thomas Aldrich's short, surprised sound that had aged him down by 15 years. She thought about a man who ate tagliatelle quietly and read 4 sentences under a bread plate without his face changing, and had called her that night not to threaten her, but to say, "That is exactly why I'm calling." The story that had started with a note was still being written. It would keep being written in the daily work of running a restaurant, where people weren't afraid, in the ongoing education of a woman learning to operate in a world she hadn't grown up in the friction and adjustment of 2 people who had come from entirely different directions, and found in the space between them something that neither of them had known to look for. But the note itself, the 4 sentences, the shaking hands, the 4 minutes at the service station, that part was finished. That part was done and permanent and true. A woman with everything to lose had decided that what someone else was losing mattered more than her own safety. And that decision, written on a torn piece of notepad paper and slipped beneath the edge of a bread plate in a Manhattan restaurant on a February night, had moved outward in every direction. From that moment, like a stone dropped in still water, touching every surface it reached, changing everything it touched, arriving at shores neither the woman nor the stone had known existed. Some things cannot be taken back once they are done. The note was one of those things. Emily Carter had written it with shaking hands and a clear conscience, and the specific courage of someone who could not find a version of events where staying silent was acceptable, and that had been enough, more than enough, exactly enough, to change everything that came after. That was the whole story. That was all of it. And it was enough.